I stood outside Paradise Valley homeless shelter in Phoenix, watching my parents' blue Honda drive away after they dumped me there like trash. My mother's final words still echoed in my mind. "She's dead weight, dump her. Homeless suits her perfectly." I was 17 years old with no money, no phone, just the clothes on my back. The cruel laughter still rang in my ears as reality crashed down on me. They actually did it. They drove me 150 miles from our Tucson home and abandoned me like I was nothing. This moment would define everything that came next. The automatic glass doors of Paradise Valley homeless shelter whooshed open, releasing a mixture of industrial disinfectant and human desperation into the scorching Arizona afternoon. I stepped inside, my legs trembling as the magnitude of my situation began to sink in. The lobby buzzed with activity as social workers shuffled paperwork behind a bulletproof glass partition, while dozens of people sat in mismatched plastic chairs, their belongings stuffed into garbage bags and worn backpacks. "Next," called a tired voice from behind the glass. I approached the window where a middle-aged Latina woman with kind eyes but exhausted features looked up from her computer screen. "I'm Cindy Morrison." I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "My parents just brought me here and said you were expecting me." The woman, whose nameplate read Martha Rodriguez, Director of Intake Services, typed something into her computer and frowned. She pulled up a file and her expression grew troubled as she read the contents. "According to this paperwork, you're 18 years old and have been diagnosed with severe behavioral disorders and substance abuse issues," Martha said, carefully studying my face. "It also states that you chose to become homeless and refuse family support." My stomach dropped. "That's not true. I'm only 17 and I don't have any behavioral problems or drug issues. My parents lied to you." Martha's frown deepened as she continued reading. "Your parents, David and Linda Morrison, signed legal documents stating you're an adult who has repeatedly chosen homelessness over family assistance. They've provided medical records indicating you've been hospitalized for psychiatric episodes and have a history of running away." The room began to spin. This wasn't just abandonment. This was a calculated betrayal with forged documents and manufactured evidence. My parents had planned every detail to make me legally unreachable and ensure no authority would intervene on my behalf. "I need to see those documents," I said, my voice growing stronger despite my shock. Martha hesitated, then slid copies through the slot beneath the bulletproof glass. As I read the fabricated medical records and false psychological evaluations, each line felt like another knife in my back. My parents had described me as violent, unpredictable, and dangerous to myself and others. They claimed I had threatened to hurt them unless they gave me money for drugs. None of it was true. I had never used drugs, never been violent, never threatened anyone. But here it was, typed on official letterheads with forged doctor signatures, painting me as a troubled adult who had chosen this fate. "These are completely fake," I whispered. But Martha's sympathetic expression told me it didn't matter what I said. The paperwork was all that mattered in the system. "I'm sorry, sweetie, but this is what we have on file. You'll be assigned to dormitory C, bed 12. You have 3 days to find employment, or you'll need to find alternative housing arrangements." She handed me a packet of forms, a thin towel, a bar of soap, and a small tube of toothpaste. "Dinner is served at 5:30. Lights out at 10. No drugs, alcohol, or weapons are permitted on the premises." I followed the signs down a long hallway, lined with motivational posters about second chances and finding inner strength. The dormitory was a large room filled with 24 narrow beds arranged in tight rows. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap perfume, and lingering cigarette smoke. "You must be the new girl," said a gravelly voice from the bed next to mine. I turned to see a woman in her 40s with stringy blonde hair and hollow cheeks. Her arms were covered in track marks, and her hands shook slightly as she extended one toward me. "I'm Tracy. Been here 6 weeks now." "Cindy," I replied, setting my meager belongings on the thin mattress. "Word of advice, honey. Tracy continued, lowering her voice. Stay away from the bathroom after dark. Don't leave anything valuable lying around. And if Big Martha asks you to do her laundry, just say yes. Trust me on that one. An elderly African-American woman sitting on the bed across from mine looked up from the book she was reading. Unlike the others, she carried herself with dignity despite her circumstances. Her clothes were clean and pressed, her gray hair was neatly braided, and her posture remained straight and proud. Don't listen to Tracy's paranoia, the woman said with a slight smile. Most people here are just down on their luck, not dangerous criminals. I'm Dorothy Washington, and I've been residing in this establishment for 2 months while I navigate some bureaucratic challenges with my veteran benefits. Dorothy's educated speech and refined mannerisms stood out sharply among the other residents. She had the bearing of someone who had lived a successful life before whatever circumstances brought her here. What kind of bureaucratic challenges? I asked, grateful to find someone who seemed stable and articulate. The Department of Veterans Affairs lost my paperwork after I was discharged from the Army 25 years ago. Dorothy explained, closing her book and giving me her full attention. I served 2 tours overseas, came home, worked as a nurse for 2 decades, then developed arthritis that ended my career. When I applied for disability benefits, they claimed I was never in the military. Without my service records, I can't prove my eligibility for veteran housing or medical care. The injustice of Dorothy's situation made my chest tighten with anger. Here was a woman who had served her country and worked hard her entire life, now sleeping on a cot in a homeless shelter because of government incompetence. That's absolutely horrible, I said. There has to be something you can do. Dorothy shrugged with the resignation of someone who had fought the system for months without success. I've contacted every agency, filled out every form, spoken to every supervisor. The response is always the same: no records, no benefits. Meanwhile, I'm spending my life savings on temporary housing and medication. Tracy snorted from her bed. At least you've got savings, Dot. Some of us don't have 2 nickels to rub together. And whose fault is that? Asked a sharp voice from the far end of the room. A heavy-set woman with graying hair and suspicious eyes approached our area. Some of us are here because life knocked us down. Others are here because they chose drugs over everything else. Mind your own business, Susan, Tracy snapped back. Not everyone gets to live in your perfect world where addiction is a choice. Ladies, please. Dorothy intervened diplomatically. We're all facing challenges here. Fighting with each other won't solve anything. Susan, who I gathered was Big Martha from Tracy's earlier warning, fixed me with a stern stare. New girl, let me give you some real advice. There are 2 kinds of people in this place: those who are working to get out and those who have given up. Figure out which one you want to be. As the tension in the room subsided, I sat on my assigned bed and tried to process everything that had happened. 12 hours ago, I had been a high school student living in suburban Tucson. Now, I was surrounded by drug addicts, veterans failed by their government, and women who had lost everything. The forged documents my parents had created meant I had no legal recourse, no way to prove my real age or circumstances. But as I looked around at my new reality, something unexpected began to grow inside me. Instead of despair, I felt a burning determination. My parents thought they had destroyed my life, but they had only revealed their own cruelty. They expected me to fail to prove their twisted narrative that I was worthless dead weight. I would prove them wrong. Whatever it took, however long it took, I would survive this and build something better. And someday, somehow, I would make them pay for what they had done. The dinner bell rang and Dorothy gestured for me to follow her to the cafeteria. First rule of shelter life, she said quietly as we walked. Never let them see you break. Show weakness here and some people will exploit it. Show strength and you'll find allies you never expected. As we entered the crowded dining hall, I straightened my shoulders and lifted my chin. My parents had thrown me away, but I wasn't garbage. I was 17 years old, I was smart, and I was going to find a way out of this nightmare. The real question wasn't whether I would survive. The question was how much I would make my parents regret the day they decided to abandon their own daughter. 3 days passed in the shelter like a slow-motion nightmare. The mandatory job search sessions yielded nothing but rejection after rejection. Without proper identification, a permanent address, or work experience, no legitimate employer would hire me. I spent my days walking the scorching Phoenix streets, filling out applications that went straight into trash cans the moment I left each establishment. On my 4th morning, as I sat in the common area staring at another stack of rejection letters, Dorothy approached with her usual purposeful stride. She carried herself like a military officer, even in this place of broken dreams, and her presence commanded respect from everyone around her. "Cindy, there's someone I'd like you to meet," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure we weren't being overheard. "But first, I need to know if you're serious about getting out of here, or if you're just going through the motions." "I'm serious," I replied immediately. "I'll do whatever it takes." Dorothy studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. "Tonight after lights out, meet me by the emergency exit near the laundry room. And Cindy, what you're about to learn must never be repeated to the staff or anyone in authority. Lives depend on it." The rest of the day crawled by with agonizing slowness. I went through the motions of attending mandatory life skills classes and group therapy sessions, but my mind was completely focused on Dorothy's mysterious invitation. What could she possibly have to show me that required such secrecy? At 10:15 minutes after the official lights out time, I crept through the darkened dormitory toward the laundry room. The industrial washers and dryers sat silent in the shadows, creating an eerie landscape of bulky shapes and mechanical sounds. Dorothy emerged from behind a large commercial dryer, moving with surprising stealth for a woman in her 60s. "Follow me and stay quiet," she whispered, leading me to what appeared to be a solid wall at the back of the laundry room. But as she pressed against a specific section, a hidden panel swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that led outside. We emerged into an alley behind the shelter where the cool desert air provided welcome relief from the stuffy dormitory atmosphere. Dorothy led me through a maze of back streets and empty lots until we reached an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of downtown Phoenix. "Before we go inside," Dorothy said, stopping at a rusty metal door, "you need to understand that what you're about to see exists because the system has failed kids like you. What we do here isn't legal, but it's necessary." She knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. The door opened to reveal a young man who looked barely older than me. He had intelligent dark eyes, closely cropped hair, and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was used to being in charge, despite his youth. "Dorothy, you're early," he said, then looked at me with curiosity. "This must be Cindy. I've heard about your situation." "Cindy, meet Marcus Johnson," Dorothy said as we stepped inside. "Marcus, this is the girl I told you about." The interior of the warehouse had been transformed into something that looked like a cross between a computer lab and a document processing center. Tables lined with laptops, printers, and laminating machines filled the space, while young people worked quietly at various stations. The walls were covered with maps of Phoenix bus schedules and what appeared to be organizational charts. "Welcome to the Phoenix Underground," Marcus said, gesturing around the space. "We help minors who've been failed by the system, abandoned by their families, or aged out of foster care. Dorothy tells me your parents falsified documents to make you legally untouchable." I nodded, still trying to process what I was seeing. "How many kids are you helping?" "Right now, about 40 in Phoenix with satellite operations in Tucson and Flagstaff," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "We provide fake identification documents, work permits, and placement services for kids who need to disappear from abusive situations or survive on their own." A girl who looked about 16 approached us carrying a manila folder. She had short red hair, multiple piercings, and paint-stained fingers. "Marcus, the documents for the Thompson case are ready for review." "Thanks, Alex. Cindy, this is Alexandra Martinez. She's our document specialist and graphic design expert." Alexandra smiled and shook my hand. "Dorothy told us about your parents' situation. That's some seriously twisted stuff. But don't worry, we can create a complete new identity for you that will hold up to basic employment screening." "How is this possible?" I asked, overwhelmed by the sophisticated operation surrounding me. Marcus gestured for me to follow him to a quieter corner of the warehouse where several comfortable chairs were arranged around a small table. "I started this 3 years ago when I was 15. My parents kicked me out when they found out I was gay. Spent 2 months sleeping in parks and dumpster diving for food before I figured out how to create fake papers and get legitimate work." The system is designed to help children who fit neat categories. Dorothy added, settling into one of the chairs. "But kids like you and Marcus fall through the cracks. Your parents exploited legal loopholes to abandon you, and Marcus was failed by a foster care system that stopped caring when he became inconvenient. So you decided to create your own system," I said, beginning to understand. "Exactly," Marcus confirmed. "We forge birth certificates, social security cards, high school transcripts, and work permits. We create entire histories for kids who need fresh starts. Most importantly, we place people in legitimate jobs with employers who don't ask too many questions." Alexandra returned with a laptop and set it on the table between us. "The beauty of our operation is that we're not really creating fake people. We're creating alternative versions of real people who need to exist in the system to survive." She pulled up what appeared to be a database filled with detailed profiles. Everyone gets a new name, a new birthday that makes them 18 or older, an education history and employment references. We even create social media profiles going back several years to establish digital footprints. "But what's the catch?" I asked, because nothing this good could be free. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. 3 months of unpaid labor. You'll work in our legitimate front business, a food truck operation that caters to construction sites and office complexes. You'll earn minimum wage after the 3-month period, but during your probation, all your earnings go toward paying for your documents and training. "It's indentured servitude," Dorothy said bluntly, "but it's voluntary indentured servitude that leads to real freedom. Marcus went through the same process when he started, and now he's helping dozens of other kids." I considered the offer. 3 months of unpaid work in exchange for a new identity and legitimate employment seemed like an incredible bargain compared to my current situation. "What kind of work exactly?" I asked. "Food service primarily," Marcus explained. "We operate 3 food trucks that serve breakfast and lunch to construction crews, office workers, and special events. The work is hard, the hours are long, and you'll be on your feet all day in the Arizona heat. But you'll learn customer service skills, money management, and food preparation. More importantly, you'll earn legitimate work references and build a verifiable employment history." Alexandra pulled up another screen showing financial records. "Our food trucks are completely legal businesses. We pay taxes, carry insurance, and maintain proper licensing. The document services are separate and funded through the legitimate business profits." "How do I know you're not just exploiting kids for cheap labor?" I asked, wanting to believe this was real but afraid to hope too much. Dorothy reached over and squeezed my hand gently. "Because I've been watching this operation for 2 months, and I've seen the results. Marcus helped a 16-year-old girl named Carmen escape an abusive foster home and get enrolled in community college. He created documents for a 17-year-old boy whose parents threw him out for being transgender. These kids aren't just surviving, now they're thriving." Marcus stood up and walked to a bulletin board covered with photographs and thank you notes. "Every success story up there represents a kid who was abandoned by the adults who were supposed to protect them. The system failed them. Their families failed them, but they didn't fail themselves." He pointed to a photo of a young woman in a graduation cap and gown. "That's Jennifer. Her parents kicked her out at 16 for getting pregnant. We gave her documents she worked the food trucks while getting her GED, and she just graduated from nursing school." Another photo showed a young man in military dress uniform. "That's Roberto. His parents were deported when he was 15 and he was left here alone. He worked for us for 8 months, then enlisted in the army using his new identity. He's stationed in Germany now." The stories were inspiring but also heartbreaking. How many kids were out there abandoned and forgotten by the very people who should have cared for them most? "I want to do this," I said finally. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning," Marcus replied. "Alexandra will take your photo and information tonight, so your documents will be ready by the end of the week. Dorothy will bring you back here at 5 a.m. to begin training." As Alexandra set up her camera equipment, Marcus handed me a thick folder. "Your new name will be Chelsea Davis, born in Denver, Colorado. You moved to Phoenix 6 months ago to live with your aunt, but she recently moved to California for work. You're 18 years old, graduated from Jefferson High School in Denver, and you're looking for employment while deciding whether to attend community college. Study this history until it becomes second nature," Dorothy advised. "If anyone asks detailed questions about Denver or your fictional high school, you need to have convincing answers." The next few hours passed in a blur of photography measurements and detailed interviews about my background and capabilities. Alexandra was remarkably thorough, asking about everything from my food allergies to my favorite music to ensure my new identity would be authentic and consistent. "One last thing," Marcus said as we prepared to leave. "Once you commit to this path, there's no going back to your old identity until you're legally old enough to reclaim it. Chelsea Davis will be who you are for the next year or more. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" I thought about my parents probably sleeping peacefully in their comfortable suburban home, believing they had successfully disposed of their unwanted daughter. They expected me to fail to prove their narrative that I was worthless and incapable of surviving without them. "I'm certain," I said firmly. "Cindy Morrison is dead. Chelsea Davis is going to build the life my parents said I could never have." As Dorothy and I made our way back through the maze of alleys toward the shelter, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day my parents abandoned me: hope. Not naive optimism, but genuine hope, backed by a concrete plan and real opportunities. Tomorrow I would begin the next phase of my journey. I would work harder than I had ever worked in my life, learn skills I never knew I needed, and slowly build the foundation for my independence. My parents thought they had destroyed my future when they drove away laughing, but they had actually given me something invaluable: the motivation to become stronger than they ever imagined possible. The abandoned girl they left at the shelter was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone determined, someone who would never again depend on anyone else's approval or support to survive. The alarm on my phone buzzed at 4:30 a.m., but I was already awake, staring at the ceiling and reviewing everything I had memorized about Chelsea Davis. Today was my first day working Marcus's food truck operation, and my new identification documents would be ready by evening. After 6 days of studying my fictional background, I could recite details about Denver neighborhoods, Jefferson High School teachers, and my imaginary aunt's apartment complex without hesitation. Dorothy was already dressed and waiting by the emergency exit when I arrived at the laundry room. She had volunteered to escort me to the warehouse until I learned the route well enough to travel alone. "Nervous?" she asked as we stepped into the cool pre-dawn air. "Terrified," I admitted, but also excited. For the first time since this nightmare started, I feel like I'm moving forward instead of just surviving. We walked through the empty streets as the eastern sky began to show the first hints of sunrise. Phoenix in the early morning was a different city than the scorching urban desert I had experienced during my job hunting failures. The air was crisp and clean, the traffic was minimal, and there was an energy of possibility that seemed to radiate from the awakening metropolis. The warehouse was already buzzing with activity when we arrived. Marcus stood in the center of the organized chaos, coordinating 3 different teams as they loaded supplies into food trucks parked in the loading bay. The operation was impressively efficient, with each person understanding their specific role in the complex logistics. "Chelsea," Marcus called out, using my new name naturally. "You'll be working with Tony Ramirez today. He's our most experienced supervisor and will teach you everything you need to know about food service and customer relations." A stocky man in his 20s approached us, wiping his hands on a clean apron. Tony had the confident demeanor of someone who had worked his way up from difficult circumstances, and his warm smile immediately put me at ease. "Welcome to the team, Chelsea," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "I started exactly where you are 18 months ago. Couldn't even operate a cash register properly. Now I manage 2 trucks and train all the new employees." "What's your story?" I asked as we walked toward one of the food trucks. "Parents kicked me out when I was 16 after I got arrested for shoplifting," Tony explained matter-of-factly. "Spent 8 months bouncing between shelters and sleeping rough before Marcus found me. This operation saved my life and gave me skills I never thought I'd have." The food truck Tony assigned me to was a gleaming silver vehicle, equipped with commercial-grade cooking equipment, refrigeration units, and a sophisticated point-of-sale system. The interior was cramped, but efficiently organized with every surface serving multiple purposes. "Today we're serving the Morning Glory construction site," Tony explained as he fired up the grills and fryers. 200 workers who start their shift at 6 a.m. and want hot breakfast before they begin. We'll serve everything from basic coffee and donuts to full breakfast platters with eggs, bacon, hash browns, and toast. For the next hour, Tony walked me through food preparation order, taking cash handling and customer service protocols. The work was fast-paced and demanding, but I found myself energized by the constant activity and the satisfaction of serving people who genuinely appreciated good food at reasonable prices. "The key to success in this business," Tony said as we drove toward the construction site, "is treating every customer like they're the most important person in the world. These workers are spending their hard-earned money with us, and they deserve excellent service and quality food." The construction site was a massive development project that would eventually become a luxury shopping center. Hundreds of workers in hard hats and reflective vests waited in organized lines as our truck pulled into the designated food service area. The demand was immediately overwhelming. "Order up 2 breakfast burritos, 1 with extra salsa, and 3 large coffees," called the first customer, a weathered man who looked like he'd been working construction for decades. I fumbled with the cash register, struggling to input the order quickly enough to keep up with Tony's efficient food preparation. My hands shook slightly as I counted change, but the customer remained patient and even offered encouragement. "Don't worry, sweetheart, you'll get the hang of it. We've all been new at something." For 4 hours, the orders came continuously. Breakfast, burritos, egg sandwiches, hash brown platters, endless cups of coffee, and dozens of specialty items I had never heard of before today. My feet ached, my back was sore, and sweat dripped down my face from the heat of the grills and the blazing Arizona sun. But something amazing was happening. With each order, I processed each customer I served. Each problem I solved, I felt stronger and more capable. These weren't handouts or charity. I was earning every dollar through hard work and dedication. "You're doing great," Tony said during a brief lull between the breakfast rush and lunch preparation. "Most people take a week to get comfortable with the pace. You're picking it up faster than anyone I've trained." The lunch rush brought a different clientele, but similar intensity. Office workers from nearby business parks ordered gourmet sandwiches, specialty salads, and artisanal coffee drinks that required much more complex preparation than the straightforward breakfast menu. "I'll have the Mediterranean wrap with extra feta, no olives, and can you substitute the regular dressing with balsamic vinaigrette?" requested a woman in an expensive business suit. "Coming right up," I replied confidently, quickly translating her modifications into the preparation instructions for Tony. As the afternoon wore on, I began to understand why Marcus required 3 months of unpaid training. This wasn't just about learning to operate a food truck. I was developing customer service skills, learning money management, understanding inventory control, and gaining experience in problem-solving under pressure. These were valuable life skills that would serve me well regardless of what career path I eventually chose. At 3 o'clock, as we began cleaning equipment and preparing to return to the warehouse, Tony's phone buzzed with an urgent text message. His expression immediately shifted from relaxed satisfaction to alert concern. "We need to pack up immediately and get out of here," he said quietly, shutting down the grills with unusual haste. "What's wrong?" I asked, catching the tension in his voice. "Immigration enforcement and police are conducting raids on food service operations throughout the city," Tony explained as he quickly secured loose equipment. Someone tipped them off about irregular documentation in the industry. My stomach dropped. If authorities discovered our operation, not only would my own fake documents be exposed, but dozens of other kids would lose their only path to legitimate employment and independence. What do we do? I asked, fighting to keep panic out of my voice. Follow my lead, stay calm, and remember that you're Chelsea Davis from Denver, Tony replied, starting the truck's engine. If we get stopped, let me do the talking, but be prepared to answer basic questions about your background. We'd barely driven 3 blocks when I saw the flashing lights in the side mirror. 2 police cars and an unmarked government sedan were following us, their emergency lights activated, but no sirens blaring. This is not good, Tony muttered, pulling the truck to the curb in front of a strip mall. Within seconds, our vehicle was surrounded by officers in tactical gear. A man in a suit, who clearly outranked the uniformed police, approached the driver's side window while other officers positioned themselves around the truck. Driver's license and vehicle registration, the suit demanded curtly. Tony handed over the requested documents with steady hands, but I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Step out of the vehicle, the officer commanded after examining the paperwork. Both of you. As we climbed down from the truck, I noticed that similar scenes were playing out at several other locations visible from our position. Food trucks, catering vans, and restaurant delivery vehicles were being stopped and searched throughout the immediate area. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the suit announced, showing his badge. We're conducting an operation targeting businesses that employ undocumented workers and use fraudulent identification documents. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized that my fake papers were about to be put to their first real test. Everything Marcus and Alexandra had taught me about maintaining my cover story would determine whether I walked away from this encounter or ended up in federal custody. "What's your name?" the ICE agent asked me directly. "Chelsea Davis," I replied, proud that my voice remained steady. "Where are you from?" "Denver, Colorado. I moved here 6 months ago to live with my aunt." "Where's your aunt now?" "She moved to California for work. I'm staying at a transitional housing facility while I save money for my own apartment." The agent studied my face carefully, looking for any signs of deception or nervousness. I forced myself to maintain eye contact and breathe normally, drawing on every acting technique I had learned in high school theater classes. "Do you have identification?" This was the moment of truth. I reached into my wallet and handed over the driver's license Alexandra had created for Chelsea Davis. The document looked perfect to my untrained eye, but I had no idea whether it would pass professional scrutiny. The agent examined the license carefully, then walked to his sedan and spent several minutes on his radio, presumably running the information through various databases. Tony and I stood silently in the blazing afternoon heat, surrounded by armed officers, while my entire future hung in the balance. When the agent returned, his expression was unreadable. "The vehicle registration shows this truck belongs to Phoenix Mobile Catering, LLC. What's your relationship to that company?" "I'm an employee," Tony answered truthfully. "I've been working for them for over a year." "And you?" the agent asked, turning back to me. "I'm a trainee. This is my first week on the job." The agent nodded slowly, then handed my license back to me. "Your documentation appears to be in order. However, we'll need to search the vehicle for any evidence of document fraud or employment irregularities." For the next 20 minutes, officers systematically searched every compartment of the food truck, while Tony and I waited in the shade of a nearby building. I watched them examine our supplies, equipment, and paperwork, knowing that any small detail could expose the sophisticated operation that had given me hope for a new life. Finally, the lead agent approached us with our vehicle keys. "You're free to go. However, I strongly advise you to ensure that all your employment documentation is legitimate and up to date. We're cracking down hard on businesses that exploit undocumented workers or use fraudulent papers." "Understood, sir," Tony replied respectfully. "Thank you for your time." As we climbed back into the truck, I felt like my legs might collapse from the rush of adrenaline and relief. The fake identification had worked perfectly. passing even professional law enforcement scrutiny. But as we drove away from the encounter, Tony's expression remained grim. "This was just the beginning," he said quietly. "They'll be watching food service operations much more closely now. Marcus needs to know that our cover may have been blown." We returned to the warehouse to find chaos. 3 other trucks had been stopped and searched, 2 employees had been detained for further questioning, and Marcus was coordinating emergency protocols to protect the most vulnerable members of the organization. "How bad is it?" Tony asked immediately upon our arrival. "Bad," Marcus replied tersely. "Someone gave authorities detailed information about our operation. They knew exactly which trucks to target and what documents to look for. This wasn't a random sweep." The implications were terrifying. If someone had infiltrated the organization or betrayed them to federal authorities, the entire network could be dismantled within days. Dozens of kids who depended on Marcus's operation for survival would be left with nothing. "What do we do now?" I asked. Marcus looked around at the frightened young faces surrounding us, then squared his shoulders with determination I had come to recognize in all the survivors I'd met. "We adapt," he said firmly. "We've built something too important to lose to one setback. If they want to play hardball, we'll show them that abandoned kids don't give up easily." As evening fell and the immediate crisis stabilized, I realized that my first day as Chelsea Davis had become a trial by fire that tested not just my new identity, but my commitment to the path I had chosen. The scared girl who had been abandoned at a homeless shelter was gone. In her place stood someone who had faced down federal agents, maintained her cover under pressure, and emerged stronger than before. My parents thought they had broken me, but they had actually forged me into someone much tougher than they ever imagined. And this was just the beginning of what I would become. 3 weeks after the federal raids, our food truck operation had adapted with remarkable resilience. Marcus had implemented new security protocols, diversified our routes, and established partnerships with construction companies that provided better legal protection for our activities. I had settled into a routine that felt almost normal despite the constant awareness that everything could change in an instant. Working as Chelsea Davis had become second nature. I could recite my fictional background without thinking, handle complex food orders during rush periods, and manage difficult customers with the confidence that came from 3 weeks of intensive training. Tony had promoted me to lead cashier, which meant I was responsible for training newer employees and handling the financial reconciliation at the end of each day. "You're ready for the next level," Tony announced on a Friday morning as we prepared for our busiest day of the week. "Today we're catering a retirement party for some big shot judge at a fancy law firm downtown. Corporate events pay 3 times our normal rates, but the standards are much higher." The law firm of Williams, Patterson & Associates occupied the top 3 floors of one of Phoenix's most prestigious office buildings. As we set up our mobile catering station in the building's executive conference room, I was struck by the opulence surrounding us. Original artwork adorned the walls, the furniture was clearly expensive, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered spectacular views of the Sonoran Desert. "Remember, these aren't construction workers," Tony advised as we arranged our serving stations. "Law firm employees expect gourmet presentations, sophisticated conversation, and flawless service. Think of this as dinner theater where you're playing the role of a professional caterer." The retirement party was for Judge Patricia Williams, a distinguished African-American woman in her early 60s, whose career had spanned 3 decades on the family court bench. As guests arrived, I overheard conversations about landmark custody cases, groundbreaking family law decisions, and the judge's reputation for fierce advocacy on behalf of abused and abandoned children. "Excuse me, miss," said a voice behind me as I arranged canapes on silver serving trays. I turned to find Judge Williams herself approaching the catering station. She moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect in courtrooms, but her expression was warm and genuinely curious. "I wanted to compliment you on the excellent presentation," Judge Williams continued. "The food looks wonderful and your service has been exemplary. Have you been working in catering for long?" "Thank you, Your Honor," I replied, using the respectful address Tony had taught me for judges. I'm relatively new to the industry, but I'm learning from excellent mentors. Something in Judge Williams' expression shifted as she studied my face more carefully. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with recognition, as if she had seen me somewhere before but couldn't place the context. "You look very familiar," she said slowly. "Have we met previously?" My stomach clenched as I realized the dangerous territory this conversation was entering. Had she seen news coverage of the federal raids? Did she recognize me from some legal database related to my parents' fraudulent documents? "I don't believe so, Your Honor," I replied carefully. "I have one of those faces people think they recognize." Judge Williams nodded thoughtfully, but continued to watch me as I worked. Throughout the afternoon, I felt her eyes on me as she mingled with other guests, accepted congratulations on her distinguished career, and shared stories about memorable cases that had shaped her judicial philosophy. As the event wound down and guests began to leave, Judge Williams approached the catering station again. This time, however, her demeanor was more serious and official. "Young lady, I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment," she said in a tone that made clear this wasn't a request, but a judicial instruction. Tony, who had overheard the conversation, stepped forward protectively. "Is there a problem with our service, Your Honor?" "Not with your service, no," Judge Williams replied, her gaze never leaving my face. "But I believe I've placed where I recognize this young woman from, and it's a matter that requires immediate attention." My heart began racing as she led me to a quiet corner of the conference room, away from the other catering staff and remaining guests. Had she somehow connected Chelsea Davis to Cindy Morrison? Were my fake documents about to be exposed in front of a room full of attorneys and law enforcement officials? 3 weeks ago, I received a briefing from Immigration and Customs Enforcement about raids on food service operations, suspected of employing undocumented workers. Judge Williams began quietly. "Your photograph was included in their surveillance materials as someone of interest who was questioned but not detained." The room seemed to spin as I realized the implications of what she was saying. Federal agents had photographed me during our encounter, and those images had been distributed to other law enforcement and judicial officials. "I don't understand," I said weakly, though of course I understood perfectly. "Furthermore," Judge Williams continued, "I've spent 30 years on the family court bench dealing with cases involving abandoned, abused, and exploited children. I've developed an instinct for recognizing young people who are living under false identities to escape dangerous family situations." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle between us before continuing. "So I'm going to ask you directly, what is your real name? How old are you actually, and what circumstances brought you to be working under assumed identity?" The moment of truth had arrived. I could continue lying to a federal judge, which was probably a felony, or I could trust this woman whose entire career had been devoted to protecting vulnerable children. "My real name is Cindy Morrison," I whispered. "I'm 17 years old, and my parents abandoned me at a homeless shelter 6 weeks ago after creating false documents claiming I was an adult with behavioral problems." Judge Williams' expression softened immediately, transforming from judicial authority to maternal concern. "Tell me everything," she said gently, "from the beginning." For the next 20 minutes, I recounted the entire nightmare, my parents driving me to Paradise Valley homeless shelter, the forged medical records claiming I was 18 and mentally unstable, my connection with Dorothy and the underground network, and my desperate attempt to build a new life as Chelsea Davis. Judge Williams listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a small pad she pulled from her purse. Her expression grew increasingly troubled as I described the sophisticated fraud my parents had perpetrated to make me legally untouchable. "This is far more serious than I initially suspected," she said when I finished my story. "Your parents didn't just abandon you. They committed multiple federal crimes, including fraud, identity theft, and child endangerment. The forged documents alone constitute felony charges. But if you report this, won't I get in trouble for using fake identification?" I asked fearfully. "You're a minor who was abandoned by your legal guardians and forced to use false documents to survive. Judge Williams explained. In legal terms, you're a victim, not a perpetrator. The adults who failed to protect you are the ones who bear criminal responsibility. She looked around the conference room to ensure we were still speaking privately, then leaned closer and lowered her voice. I'm going to make you an offer that could change your life, she said. I can help you pursue legal action against your parents, assist with your emancipation proceedings, and connect you with resources specifically designed for abandoned minors. But it means giving up your false identity and fighting this battle using your real name. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying. For weeks I had dreamed of making my parents pay for their cruelty, but I had assumed legal justice was impossible, given their careful fraud. What would happen to Marcus and the other kids? I asked, because I couldn't accept help that might harm the people who would save my life. Judge Williams smiled for the first time since our conversation began. The underground network you described is actually performing a valuable social service that the official system has failed to provide. While I can't officially endorse document fraud, I can certainly advocate for alternative approaches that help abandon youth without requiring illegal activities. She pulled a business card from her purse and handed it to me. Patricia Williams, retired family court judge, youth advocacy consultant. I read. Retirement doesn't mean I stop caring about vulnerable children, she explained. It just means I have more flexibility to help in ways that weren't possible while I was on the bench. I'd like to take your case pro bono and help you build a legal foundation for your future. Why would you do that for someone you just met? I asked, overwhelmed by the unexpected offer. Because 30 years ago, I was a young African-American woman trying to build a legal career in a system that wasn't designed for people like me, Judge Williams replied. A retired judge named Samuel Morrison took a chance on me, provided mentorship I couldn't afford, and helped me navigate obstacles that would have ended my career before it started. The irony wasn't lost on me that a judge named Morrison was offering to help me fight against people with the same last name who had tried to destroy my life. I owe my entire career to someone who saw potential in a struggling young woman and decided to invest in her future, Judge Williams continued. Now I have the opportunity to pay that kindness forward. The question is whether you're ready to fight for justice or if you prefer to continue hiding behind a false identity. As I looked around the elegant conference room surrounded by the evidence of Judge Williams's successful career, I realized this was the moment that would define the rest of my life. I could continue living as Chelsea Davis, working food trucks, and hoping to eventually build a modest existence on the margins of society. Or I could become Cindy Morrison again and fight for the justice and recognition I deserved. I want to fight, I said firmly. I want to make them pay for what they did, and I want to help other kids who are going through the same thing. Judge Williams smiled and shook my hand formally. Then, welcome to the legal system, Cindy Morrison. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but I promise you this. By the time we're finished, your parents will deeply regret the day they decided to abandon their daughter. As Tony and I packed up our catering equipment and prepared to return to the warehouse, I felt like I was standing at the threshold of an entirely new chapter in my life. The scared, abandoned girl was about to become a fighter with powerful allies and legal resources. My parents had laughed when they drove away, confident they had successfully disposed of their unwanted burden. Soon they would discover that their discarded daughter had found champions they never expected and was preparing to seek justice they never imagined possible. The real battle was about to begin. Judge Williams wasted no time following through on her promise to help me pursue legal action against my parents. 2 days after our meeting at the law firm, she contacted me at the warehouse with instructions to meet her at the Maricopa County Family Court building for what she called preliminary fact-gathering. The courthouse was an imposing structure of glass and concrete that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered seeking justice. As I walked through the metal detectors and past the armed security guards, I felt the weight of the legal system's power and complexity. This was Judge Williams' world, where she had spent 3 decades protecting vulnerable children from the very type of abuse I had experienced. Cindy, she called from across the lobby, approaching with a thick manila folder and the purposeful stride I had come to associate with her professional demeanor. "Thank you for coming. I've been conducting some preliminary research into your parents' activities, and what I've discovered is far worse than either of us initially suspected." She led me to a small conference room typically used for attorney-client meetings. The space was sterile and windowless, designed for privacy and serious conversations about life-changing legal matters. "Before we begin," Judge Williams said, settling into her chair and opening the folder, "I want you to understand that what I'm about to share with you will be emotionally difficult. The level of fraud your parents committed extends far beyond simple abandonment." My stomach tightened as she pulled out a stack of official documents bearing government seals and legal letterheads. "I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to several federal agencies to investigate your parents' financial activities over the past 2 years," she explained. "What we discovered is a systematic pattern of fraud that has been ongoing since long before they abandoned you." She spread the first set of documents across the table, revealing forms from the Social Security Administration, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Internal Revenue Service. "David and Linda Morrison have been collecting Social Security disability benefits on your behalf for the past 24 months. Judge Williams continued, her voice taking on the prosecutorial tone she had developed during decades of courtroom advocacy. "They claimed you suffered from severe mental disabilities that prevented you from functioning independently." I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. "But I've never been disabled. I've never even been diagnosed with any mental health conditions." "Exactly," Judge Williams confirmed. "They submitted fraudulent medical records, forged doctor signatures, and created an entirely fictional medical history to qualify you for benefits. The monthly payments totaled $1,200, which they collected directly and used for their own expenses." She pulled out another set of documents, these bearing the seal of the Arizona Department of Economic Security. Additionally, they applied for and received Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program benefits, claiming they were caring for a disabled dependent who required special dietary accommodations. That added another $300 per month to their fraudulent income. The betrayal cut deeper with each revelation. Not only had my parents abandoned me, but they had been systematically stealing government benefits intended to support my supposed disabilities, while I was sleeping in a homeless shelter and scraping together survival money working food trucks. "But surely the government would have required proof of my disability," I said, struggling to understand how such extensive fraud was possible. Judge Williams nodded grimly. "That's where the conspiracy becomes particularly sophisticated. Your parents didn't act alone." She produced a new set of documents that made my blood run cold. Medical records bearing the letterhead of Desert Springs Family Practice, signed by Dr. Michael Chen, detailed extensive psychiatric evaluations, ongoing treatment plans, and progressive deterioration of my supposed mental health. "Dr. Chen is a real physician with a legitimate practice," Judge Williams explained. "However, according to his office records, you have never been a patient there. These documents are complete fabrications." "How is that possible?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're still investigating, but it appears Dr. Chen's office was burglarized 18 months ago. Among the items stolen were prescription pads, letterhead, and his official stamp. We believe your parents or someone working with them used these materials to create fraudulent medical records." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't a spontaneous decision to abandon an unwanted child. This was a calculated long-term fraud operation that had been planned and executed over years. "There's more." Judge Williams continued pulling out tax documents that made my hands shake with rage. "For the past 3 years, your parents have claimed you as a dependent on their federal and state tax returns, receiving approximately $4,000 annually in tax credits for supporting a disabled family member. Meanwhile, you were living in poverty, sleeping in shelters, and working illegally just to survive. She spread all the documents across the table, creating a visual representation of the systematic theft my parents had perpetrated using my identity. In total, over the past 2 years, David and Linda Morrison have fraudulently collected over $43,000 in government benefits tax credits and disability payments using your name and fabricated medical conditions. Every dollar they stole was money intended to help genuinely disabled individuals and families in need. The conference room felt like it was closing in around me as the full magnitude of my parents' betrayal became clear. They hadn't just abandoned me, they had been profiting from my supposed suffering while I faced genuine hardship and homelessness. "What can we do about this?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. Judge Williams smiled with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who had just uncovered the evidence needed to secure a conviction. "We're going to pursue federal criminal charges for fraud, identity theft conspiracy, and theft of government benefits. We're also filing civil lawsuits to recover every dollar they stole, plus punitive damages for the emotional trauma they inflicted." She pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making notes as she outlined our strategy. "Furthermore, this evidence completely destroys any claim they might make to legal guardianship or parental authority. No court in the country will grant custody rights to parents who've been systematically defrauding the government using their child's identity." "How long will all this take?" I asked, both excited about the prospect of justice and overwhelmed by the complexity of the legal process. "Federal criminal cases typically take 12 to 18 months from filing to trial," Judge Williams explained. "However, we can begin civil proceedings immediately, and I'm confident we can secure emergency orders freezing their assets to prevent them from hiding money or fleeing the jurisdiction." She paused, studying my face carefully before continuing. "There's something else you should know. Under federal victim compensation laws, you're entitled to financial assistance for the crimes committed against you. The fraud they perpetrated qualifies you for emergency housing assistance, educational support, and psychological counseling services. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had real power and genuine advocates working on my behalf. The legal system that had seemed impossibly complex and intimidating was actually designed to protect victims like me and punish perpetrators like my parents. I want to proceed with everything," I said firmly. "Criminal charges, civil lawsuits, victim compensation, all of it. I want them to face consequences for every crime they committed." Judge Williams nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I hoped you would say. However, I need you to understand that once we file these charges, your story will likely become public. Criminal cases involving fraud and child abandonment often attract media attention, especially when the amounts involved are this substantial." "I'm not afraid of publicity," I replied. "Maybe other kids in similar situations will see that it's possible to fight back." "That's a very mature perspective," Judge Williams said, gathering the documents back into her folder. "Now there's one more piece of information I need to share with you, and this one is actually positive news." She pulled out a final document that bore the seal of the Phoenix Police Department. "When you were initially abandoned at Paradise Valley Homeless Shelter, the staff was required by law to file a report with Child Protective Services since the intake documents claimed you were 17. However, because your parents' fraudulent paperwork stated you were 18, CPS never followed up on the case." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means there's an official record of your abandonment created by neutral third parties that contradicts your parents' claims of temporary placement. The shelter staff documented that you arrived with no money, no phone, no emergency contacts, and no plan for future care. That's textbook evidence of child abandonment." As we prepared to leave the courthouse, Judge Williams handed me her business card again, this time with her personal cell phone number written on the back. "The next few weeks are going to be challenging," she said. "Federal agents will want to interview you extensively about the fraud. Prosecutors will need detailed statements about your abandonment and subsequent survival. The media will probably want to tell your story." "I can handle it," I said. And for the first time since this journey began, I truly believed that was true. "I know you can," Judge Williams replied. You've already survived the worst they could do to you. Everything from this point forward is about justice and recovery." As I walked out of the courthouse and into the blazing Arizona afternoon, I felt fundamentally different than I had just 2 hours earlier. I was no longer Cindy Morrison, the abandoned victim, or Chelsea Davis, the hidden survivor. I was becoming something new, a plaintiff with the power of the legal system behind her, and the evidence needed to hold my parents accountable for their crimes. My parents thought they had successfully erased me from their lives while profiting from my fictional suffering. Soon they would discover that their discarded daughter had become their worst nightmare, a victim with proof allies with power and the determination to seek justice no matter how long it took. The scared girl they had laughed at while driving away was about to become the plaintiff who would make them pay for every crime they had committed in her name. 3 weeks after my meeting with Judge Williams at the courthouse, my life had transformed into a whirlwind of legal proceedings, victim advocacy appointments, and educational opportunities I never could have imagined. The federal investigation into my parents' fraud had officially begun, and I was now enrolled in a special program for crime victims that provided emergency housing legal support and educational assistance. The transitional housing facility where I now lived was a dramatic improvement from Paradise Valley Homeless Shelter. Located in a quiet residential neighborhood, the 2-story building housed 20 young adults who were transitioning from crisis situations to independent living. My room was small but private, furnished with a desk dresser and twin bed that felt luxurious after weeks of dormitory-style accommodations. Cindy Morrison called a woman's voice from the hallway outside the community classroom, where I was completing my morning homework assignments. I looked up to see a professional woman in her 40s, approaching with a warm smile and an armful of educational materials. She had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to helping people navigate complex systems, and her presence immediately put me at ease. "I'm Jennifer Hayes," she said, extending her hand as she settled into the chair across from me. "I'm the victim advocate assigned to your case, but I also coordinate educational programs for young adults who've experienced family-related crimes." Jennifer spread several brochures and applications across the table, each bearing the logos of different educational institutions and scholarship programs. "Judge Williams asked me to meet with you because your academic performance on the GED practice tests has been exceptional," Jennifer continued. "You're scoring in the top 5% nationally, which opens up educational opportunities most crime victims never realize are available." I'd been attending GED preparation classes for 2 weeks, partly to stay busy while legal proceedings advanced, and partly because I had missed so much traditional schooling during the chaos of my abandonment and survival. The coursework had been surprisingly easy, covering material I had already mastered during my junior year of high school. "What kind of opportunities?" I asked, intrigued by the possibilities. Jennifer opened the first brochure revealing information about Arizona State University's accelerated degree programs. ASU offers special admission pathways for students who've experienced educational disruption due to family crisis abuse or abandonment. The program allows qualified students to begin college coursework while completing their high school equivalency requirements. She pointed to a section detailing the program's benefits: reduced tuition rates, priority housing assignments, academic mentoring, and integration with social services for students transitioning from difficult circumstances. "But the most relevant opportunity for your situation," Jennifer continued, opening another brochure, "is the Crime Victim Education Fund. This is a federal program that provides full scholarships, living allowances, and support services for young people whose education was disrupted by violent crimes or family-related offenses." The financial details were staggering. Full tuition coverage, monthly living stipends of $1,500, textbook allowances, and access to counseling services specifically designed for trauma survivors pursuing higher education. "The fraud and abandonment you experienced qualify as family-related crimes under federal law," Jennifer explained. Your case is particularly strong because of the systematic nature of the financial fraud and the extensive documentation we've gathered. She pulled out an application packet that was significantly thicker than standard college admission materials. The application process is intensive, she continued. You'll need to provide detailed statements about the crimes committed against you, undergo psychological evaluation to document the trauma impact and demonstrate your academic readiness for college-level work. But based on what Judge Williams has told me about your case, you're an ideal candidate. How soon could I start classes? I asked, excitement building as I envisioned a future I had never dared to imagine. If we submit your application within the next 2 weeks, you could begin the spring semester at ASU, Jennifer replied. That's only 6 weeks away. You'd start with a reduced course load while completing your GED, then transition to full-time enrollment once you've earned your high school equivalency. The prospect of attending college while my legal case against my parents moved through the courts seemed almost too good to be true. For months I had been focused purely on survival. Now suddenly I was being offered opportunities to build a real future. There's one more program I want to discuss with you, Jennifer said, opening a folder marked confidential in red letters. This one is specifically for victims of family fraud and identity theft. The documents inside detailed a pilot program administered jointly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Education. Victims of family-related financial crimes could receive special educational grants, expedited admission to federal job training programs, and priority consideration for government internships. The program was created because federal investigators recognized that family fraud cases often involve children who were prevented from accessing education or preparing for careers, Jennifer explained. Your case fits the profile perfectly: systematic fraud, educational disruption, and abandonment by the perpetrators. She showed me testimonials from other program participants whose stories shared disturbing similarities to my own. Young adults whose parents had stolen their identities to commit fraud, kids who had been kept out of school to facilitate various scams, teens who discovered their families had been using their social security numbers to obtain credit cards and loans. What's most important about this program, Jennifer continued, is that it's designed to help victims become financially independent as quickly as possible. The goal is to ensure that you're never again vulnerable to the kind of exploitation your parents perpetrated. As I reviewed the application materials, one section caught my attention that made my heart race with possibility. The program included internship opportunities with federal agencies that investigated financial crimes, victim advocacy organizations, and legal aid societies that represented abandoned children. I could actually help other kids going through what I experienced. I said, the idea taking root in my mind. That's often what motivates the most successful program participants, Jennifer confirmed. Turning your trauma into expertise that helps other victims is one of the most effective paths to long-term healing and professional satisfaction. She gathered the materials back into an organized stack and handed me a comprehensive application packet. I'm going to be direct with you about something, Jennifer said, her tone becoming more serious. The next few months are going to be incredibly challenging. The federal investigation will intensify. Your parents will likely hire attorneys and fight back aggressively, and media attention could make your private trauma very public. I understand, I replied, though I wasn't sure I truly grasped what she was warning me about. College can provide stability and forward momentum during a period when everything else in your life feels chaotic. Jennifer continued, having academic goals and educational structure will give you something positive to focus on when the legal proceedings become overwhelming. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to her calendar application. I'd like to schedule you for a campus visit next week. You'll meet with admission counselors, tour the facilities, and get a realistic sense of what college life would involve. The Crime Victim Education Fund also provides mentoring services, so you'd be paired with a graduate student who survived similar family trauma. The conversation continued for another hour as Jennifer walked me through financial aid applications, housing options, and academic program choices. By the time she prepared to leave, I had a clear roadmap for transforming my legal victory against my parents into educational opportunities that could reshape my entire future. "One last thing," Jennifer said as she gathered her materials. "Don't let anyone convince you that accepting help makes you weak or dependent. You've survived abandonment, homelessness, and systematic fraud. Now you're using available resources to build the life you deserve. That's not weakness, that's strategic intelligence." As evening approached and I sat in my small room reviewing the application materials, I reflected on how dramatically my circumstances had changed in just a few weeks. The transition from sleeping in a homeless shelter to preparing for college admission felt almost surreal. But as I began filling out the detailed application forms, describing the crimes committed against me, and outlining my educational goals, I realized that every word I wrote was another step away from being a victim and toward becoming an advocate. My parents had tried to destroy my future by abandoning me and stealing my identity. Instead, their crimes had qualified me for educational opportunities I never would have discovered otherwise. The fraud they committed to exploit me had become the foundation for my liberation from them. Soon I would be attending college classes while they faced criminal trials. I would be building a career in victim advocacy while they dealt with the consequences of their greed and cruelty. The daughter they had discarded as dead weight was about to become someone they could never have imagined, educated, empowered, and determined to help other families torn apart by similar betrayals. The laughter they shared while driving away from that homeless shelter was about to be replaced by something far less amusing, the sound of their victim fighting back with every advantage the system could provide. 6 weeks into my college preparation, and 2 months after Judge Williams had taken my case, our legal strategy took an unexpected turn when local media discovered my story. What began as a routine follow-up piece about youth homelessness in Phoenix quickly exploded into a national news sensation that would change everything about my fight for justice. The initial contact came on a Tuesday morning while I was attending my GED completion ceremony at the Victim Advocacy Center. I had successfully passed all 5 sections of the test with scores that placed me in the top 10%, nationally qualifying for immediate admission to Arizona State University's spring semester. Cindy Morrison called a woman with a professional camera crew following behind her as I emerged from the testing center. Sarah Chen, an investigative reporter for KPNX News, approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to pursuing difficult stories. She was younger than I expected, probably in her early 30s, with intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that suggested she didn't accept easy answers to complex questions. "I'm Sarah Chen from Channel 12 News," she said, extending her hand while her cameraman remained at a respectful distance. "I've been investigating youth homelessness in the Phoenix area, and several sources suggested I speak with you about your experiences." My immediate instinct was to decline the interview and protect the privacy Judge Williams and I had carefully maintained during our legal preparations. But something in Sarah's manner suggested she was genuinely interested in the broader issue, rather than exploiting my personal trauma for sensational television. "What kind of investigation are you conducting?" I asked cautiously. "I'm examining how many young people end up homeless due to family abandonment rather than personal choices," Sarah explained. "Most media coverage focuses on addiction, mental illness, or behavioral problems, but my research indicates that a significant number of homeless youth are actually victims of parental abuse or abandonment." She pulled out a tablet and showed me preliminary statistics that supported her thesis. According to her research, nearly 30% of homeless youth reported being kicked out or abandoned by family members, but less than 5% of news coverage addressed family-based causes of youth homelessness. "Your story could help change how people understand this issue," Sarah continued. "But I want to be completely transparent. Investigating your case might uncover details about your parents' activities that could affect your legal proceedings." I considered her proposal carefully. Judge Williams had warned me that media attention was likely once criminal charges were filed, but she had also emphasized that controlling the narrative could be advantageous for our case. I'll need to speak with my attorney before agreeing to anything, I said finally. Of course, Sarah replied, handing me her business card. But I should mention that I've already begun researching your parents' activities, and what I've discovered suggests this story is much larger than individual family dysfunction. Her comment sent a chill down my spine. If a television reporter had uncovered additional evidence about my parents' crimes, it could either strengthen our case or complicate our legal strategy in ways I couldn't anticipate. That evening, I contacted Judge Williams to discuss Sarah's proposal. She listened thoughtfully as I described the reporter's approach and her suggestion that the story extended beyond my individual case. Media attention is a double-edged sword, Judge Williams explained during our phone conversation. It can generate public support and pressure prosecutors to pursue charges aggressively, but it can also alert your parents to our investigation and give them time to hide assets or develop counter-strategies. What do you think I should do? I asked. Let me contact Ms. Chen directly and discuss the scope of her investigation, Judge Williams replied. If she's uncovered evidence that supports our case, it might benefit us to cooperate. If she's pursuing a sensationalized angle that could harm our legal strategy, we'll decline. 2 days later, Judge Williams called with surprising news. Sarah Chen has been investigating a pattern of family fraud cases across Arizona, and your parents appear to be part of a larger network, she said. She's identified at least 6 other families who use similar methods to abandon children while collecting government benefits. The implications were staggering. My parents weren't isolated criminals, but part of a systematic scheme that had victimized dozens of children across the state. She's also uncovered evidence that Dr. Chen, the physician whose stolen materials your parents used to create fraudulent medical records, was targeted specifically because his patient files contained information about families receiving disability benefits. Judge Williams continued. That means this wasn't opportunistic crime, I said, understanding the significance immediately. They planned it. Exactly. And if Ms. Chen has documented evidence of the broader conspiracy, her investigation could strengthen our case considerably. After extensive discussion, Judge Williams and I agreed to cooperate with Sarah's investigation under strict conditions. The interview would focus on systemic issues rather than personal details, and Sarah would share any evidence she uncovered that was relevant to our legal case. The interview took place the following week at the Victim Advocacy Center with Judge Williams present to ensure my interests were protected. Sarah's questions were thoughtful and respectful, focusing on the policy failures that allowed family abandonment and fraud to go undetected. How many other kids do you think are in situations similar to what you experienced? Sarah asked as cameras rolled. Based on what I saw at the homeless shelter and through my work with underground support networks, I'd say there are hundreds of abandoned children in Phoenix alone, I replied. The difference is that most of them don't have advocates who understand how to navigate the legal system. What would you want other families to understand about youth homelessness? That most homeless kids aren't there by choice, I said firmly. They're there because the adults who were supposed to protect them failed in their basic responsibilities, and that failure often involves fraud, abuse, or exploitation that goes far beyond simple neglect. The interview lasted 90 minutes, covering everything from the inadequacy of shelter services to the sophistication of document fraud networks. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah asked about my future plans. I'm starting college in January with the goal of becoming a victim advocate and family court attorney, I said. I want to help other kids fight back against the adults who exploit them, and I want to change laws that make it too easy for parents to abandon their children without consequences. When the segment aired 3 days later, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The story was picked up by national news networks, shared millions of times on social media, and generated hundreds of comments from viewers who shared similar experiences of family abandonment and fraud. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source, my parents themselves. Within 24 hours of the national broadcast, David and Linda Morrison contacted a Phoenix law firm and issued a public statement claiming that my media appearance constituted defamation and harassment. They portrayed themselves as loving parents who'd been forced to seek temporary care for a troubled daughter and were now being victimized by false accusations. "We are heartbroken that our daughter has chosen to make private family matters public," their statement read. "We love Cindy deeply and have been working with social services to provide the specialized care she needs for her ongoing mental health challenges." The statement was accompanied by carefully selected photographs of family vacations and holiday celebrations designed to present them as normal, caring parents who were being unfairly persecuted. But their public response contained a crucial tactical error that Judge Williams immediately recognized by issuing statements to the media. They had waived certain privacy protections and opened themselves to more aggressive investigation by both law enforcement and journalists. "Their lawyers just made our job much easier," Judge Williams explained during an emergency meeting the day after their statement was released. "By claiming you have mental health issues that required specialized care, they've opened the door for us to subpoena all medical records and prove that no such care was ever provided." More importantly, their public response had triggered exactly the kind of media attention Judge Williams had hoped to generate. Within a week, investigative journalists from 3 national news organizations had contacted our legal team seeking information about family fraud networks in Arizona. The abandoned daughter my parents thought they had silenced was now at the center of a national conversation about family abuse, government fraud, and the failure of social services to protect vulnerable children. Their attempt to control the narrative had backfired spectacularly, transforming a local news story into a federal investigation that would soon reach far beyond their individual crimes. The laughter they had shared while driving away from the homeless shelter was about to be replaced by something far more serious, the realization that their discarded daughter had become the catalyst for exposing an entire network of family fraud that could send them to federal prison for decades. The media attention surrounding my story had attracted interest from unexpected quarters, but none more surprising than the phone call I received on a Wednesday morning in early November. I was studying for my first round of college placement exams when Jennifer Hayes contacted me with news that would change the trajectory of my legal battle in ways no one could have anticipated. "Cindy, I need you to come to the Advocacy Center immediately," Jennifer said, her voice containing an excitement I had never heard before. "There's someone here who wants to meet you, and this could be the opportunity of a lifetime." I arrived to find Jennifer speaking with a man in his 50s who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making important decisions. He was dressed casually but expensively, and something about his presence suggested significant wealth and influence. "Cindy, I'd like you to meet James Wheeler," Jennifer said as I approached. "Mr. Wheeler is the founder and CEO of Wheeler Technologies here in Phoenix." James Wheeler stood and shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who understood the importance of first impressions. His eyes were kind but intelligent, and he studied my face with the intensity of someone evaluating a potential investment. "Ms. Morrison, I saw your interview with Sarah Chen, and I've been following your legal case through media reports," he said. "Your story resonated with me personally because I faced similar family challenges when I was your age." He gestured for us to sit in the Advocacy Center's conference room where he had apparently been waiting for some time. 25 years ago, my father abandoned our family when I was 17, leaving my mother, 2 younger siblings, and me with nothing but debt and broken promises. James continued. "I worked 3 jobs while finishing high school, then put myself through college on scholarships and student loans. The parallel to my situation was obvious, but I sensed he had more than personal sympathy to offer. Wheeler Technologies now employs over 800 people and generates annual revenue of $200 million, he said matter-of-factly. I've built my success on the principle that abandoned and underestimated young people often possess the drive and intelligence to achieve remarkable things when given proper opportunities. He pulled out a leather portfolio and extracted several documents that made my heart race with possibility. I'd like to offer you a full educational scholarship to Arizona State University covering tuition, housing, textbooks, and living expenses for the duration of your undergraduate and graduate studies, James said, sliding the first document across the table. The scholarship agreement detailed financial support that exceeded anything I had imagined possible. Full tuition coverage for up to 6 years monthly living allowances of $2,000 internship opportunities at Wheeler Technologies, and mentoring support from successful professionals who'd overcome similar family challenges. Additionally, James continued opening a second document. I'm offering you a paid internship position in our corporate social responsibility department where you'd help develop programs supporting other young people who've experienced family abandonment or abuse. The internship package included summer employment, part-time work during school years, and the possibility of full-time hiring upon graduation. The starting salary was more than most college graduates earned in their first jobs. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, overwhelmed by the generosity but suspicious of motives I didn't understand. Because 25 years ago, a successful businessman named Robert Martinez took a chance on an angry abandoned kid who was working as a dishwasher while attending community college, James replied. He provided educational support, job opportunities, and mentoring that changed the entire trajectory of my life. He leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more personal and reflective. Mr. Martinez told me that success creates an obligation to help others who face similar challenges. He said the best way to honor his investment in my future was to identify other abandoned kids with potential and provide them with the same opportunities. The conversation continued for another hour as James outlined his vision for supporting young people who had been failed by their families and the traditional social service system. His company had apparently helped dozens of similar cases over the years, creating what he called a network of survivors who supported each other personally and professionally. "There's one condition to this offer," James said as our meeting concluded. "You'll need to maintain a grade point average of 3.5 or higher, participate in our mentoring programs, and commit to helping other program participants once you've established your own career." "I accept," I said, immediately recognizing that this was exactly the kind of opportunity I needed to build lasting independence from my parents and their crimes. But as James prepared to leave, Jennifer's expression grew troubled. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "This morning, before Mr. Wheeler arrived, I received a call from an attorney representing your parents. They're planning to file legal papers claiming guardianship rights over you and any financial benefits you receive." My stomach dropped as the implications became clear. My parents had apparently learned about the various scholarships and opportunities I was receiving through media coverage, and they were now attempting to regain legal control over my life to access those financial resources. "What exactly are they claiming?" James asked, his business-oriented mind immediately recognizing the threat this posed to our agreement. "They're arguing that they never legally relinquished parental custody, that placing you in the homeless shelter was temporary emergency care, and that they have the right to manage your finances until you turn 21, Jennifer explained. James's expression hardened as he processed this information. "So they abandoned her when she had nothing, and now they want custody when she's receiving financial opportunities." "Exactly," Jennifer confirmed. "Their attorney claims they're concerned about Cindy being exploited by adults who are offering financial assistance in exchange for publicity about her case." The cruel irony was staggering. The parents who had laughed while abandoning me at a homeless shelter were now positioning themselves as protective guardians concerned about my welfare. "What are our options?" I asked, fighting to keep panic out of my voice. "Judge Williams is preparing a counter-filing that will expose the full extent of their fraudulent activities," Jennifer replied. "But family court proceedings can take months to resolve, and in the meantime, they could potentially freeze your access to scholarships or other financial assistance." James Wheeler had been listening thoughtfully to this exchange, and now he spoke with the decisive tone of someone accustomed to solving complex problems. "I'm going to make you an additional offer," he said, pulling out his phone and scrolling to his contacts. Wheeler Technologies employs some of the best family law attorneys in Arizona. I'm putting them at your disposal pro bono to fight this guardianship claim as aggressively as possible. "You would do that for someone you just met?" I asked. "I'm doing it for someone who reminds me of myself 25 years ago," James replied. "And I'm doing it because parents who abandon their children don't get to reclaim them when those children succeed despite their neglect." He made several phone calls over the next few minutes, speaking with attorneys whose names I recognized from prestigious law firm letterheads around Phoenix. By the time he finished, I had a team of 5 family law specialists preparing to contest my parents' guardianship claim. "There's one more thing," James said as he prepared to leave. "When this guardianship battle becomes public, and it will, your parents are going to face a level of scrutiny they're not prepared for. My attorneys are very good at their jobs, and they don't lose custody cases to parents with criminal fraud charges pending." As I walked home from the advocacy center that evening, I reflected on the bizarre turns my life had taken since the day my parents abandoned me. In 4 months, I had gone from sleeping in a homeless shelter to receiving full college scholarships and corporate internships from successful business leaders. But I had also learned that my parents' cruelty had no limits. Not content with the damage they had already inflicted, they were now attempting to regain control over my life, specifically to exploit the opportunities I had earned through my own resilience and the kindness of strangers. They had laughed while driving away, confident they had successfully disposed of their unwanted burden. Now they wanted to reclaim that same burden because it had become potentially profitable. The coming legal battle would determine whether I could move forward with building the life I deserved, or whether I would be forced back under the control of people who had already proven they were willing to destroy me for their own benefit. But this time I wasn't facing them alone. I had advocates, attorneys, financial resources, and educational opportunities they couldn't take away. The scared, abandoned girl they had left at the shelter was gone, replaced by someone who understood how to fight back with every advantage the system could provide. The parents who had thrown me away like garbage were about to discover that their discarded daughter had become someone far more formidable than they ever imagined possible. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early December, exactly 4 months after my parents had abandoned me at Paradise Valley Homeless Shelter. As I sat in the Maricopa County Family Courthouse, waiting for the proceedings to begin, I could barely recognize the person I had been when this nightmare started. Judge Williams sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, flanked by 2 attorneys from Wheeler Technologies' legal team. Across the aisle, my parents sat with their recently hired lawyer, a middle-aged man who specialized in family reunification cases, and had apparently convinced them that regaining custody would be simple. This was the first time I had seen David and Linda Morrison since they drove away laughing 4 months earlier. They looked smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow, and their expensive clothes couldn't hide the stress and worry that showed clearly in their faces. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Michael Rodriguez," announced the bailiff as the proceedings began. Judge Rodriguez was a stern man in his 60s who had a reputation for no-nonsense handling of family court matters. He reviewed the case files with careful attention before addressing the courtroom. "This is a highly unusual custody matter," Judge Rodriguez began. "We have parents seeking to regain guardianship of a minor daughter they allegedly placed in temporary care, while said minor is represented by counsel claiming abandonment and requesting emancipation based on criminal fraud charges. My parents' attorney, Thomas Brennan, stood to present their case first. Your Honor, David and Linda Morrison are loving parents who made the difficult decision to seek temporary residential care for their daughter when her behavioral issues became too severe for them to manage at home," Brennan argued. "They are now ready to resume custody and are concerned that their daughter has been manipulated by adults seeking to exploit her situation for financial gain." Brennan presented carefully curated evidence designed to support their narrative photographs of family vacations, report cards showing my academic success before my behavioral decline, and character references from neighbors who described the Morrisons as devoted parents facing a family crisis. Furthermore, Brennan continued, "We believe that certain individuals and organizations have encouraged Cindy to make false accusations against her parents in order to qualify for victim compensation funds and educational scholarships that total over $400,000. When it was our turn to respond, Judge Williams stood with the confidence of someone who had spent 30 years destroying exactly this type of fraudulent family court claim. Your Honor, the defendant's portrayal of loving parents facing a temporary crisis is contradicted by extensive evidence of systematic criminal fraud spanning multiple years." She began approaching the bench with a thick folder of documents. David and Linda Morrison didn't seek temporary care for their daughter. They abandoned her at a homeless shelter 150 miles from their home after creating fraudulent medical records claiming she was 18 years old and mentally unstable to prevent legal intervention. Judge Williams presented the forged documents' fraudulent disability benefit applications and evidence of identity theft that federal prosecutors were using to build their criminal case. Moreover, while claiming to seek appropriate care for their daughter, the defendants were systematically stealing government benefits intended to support her supposed disabilities, collecting over $43,000 in fraudulent payments while she lived in poverty and homelessness. As Judge Williams outlined the evidence against my parents, I watched their confident expressions slowly transform into panic and disbelief. It was clear that their attorney had not been fully informed about the extent of their criminal activities. Your Honor, Judge Williams continued, "This is not a custody dispute between loving parents and a troubled teenager. This is a criminal conspiracy case where the perpetrators are attempting to regain control over their victim to access financial opportunities she has earned through her own resilience." But the most devastating moment came when Judge Williams introduced evidence that neither my parents nor their attorney had anticipated. 3 weeks ago, we obtained security camera footage from Paradise Valley Homeless Shelter that recorded the defendants' behavior on the day they abandoned their daughter. Judge Williams announced producing a digital video file. My heart began racing as I realized what she was about to show. The shelter's parking lot security cameras had apparently captured everything that happened the day my parents drove away. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A video evidence that contradicts every claim the defendants have made about their motivations and intentions. The courtroom's large monitor displayed grainy but clear security footage showing my parents' blue Honda pulling into the shelter's parking lot. The timestamp indicated this was recorded on August 15th, the day they abandoned me. The video showed all three of us exiting the vehicle with my parents carrying the fake documents they had prepared, but it was the footage after they emerged from the building that destroyed their custody claim completely. The camera captured audio as well as video, and the courtroom filled with the sound of my parents' voices as they walked back to their car. "Finally got rid of our dead weight," Linda's voice said clearly. "Let's see how Princess survives on her own," David responded, laughing. "She's not our problem anymore," Linda continued. "Homeless suits her perfectly." The video showed them high-fiving, laughing together, and celebrating as they drove away. Their body language and expressions showed unmistakable relief and satisfaction, not the anguish of parents making a difficult decision about their child's care. The courtroom was silent as the video concluded. My parents sat frozen in shock, apparently realizing for the first time that their cruel celebration had been recorded for posterity. Your Honor, Judge Williams said quietly, "This footage was obtained during a federal investigation into document fraud at homeless shelters throughout Arizona. It was discovered by FBI agents who were investigating the systematic abandonment of children by parents seeking to fraudulently collect government benefits." Judge Rodriguez studied the faces of my parents with the stern expression of someone who had just witnessed evidence of genuine child abuse. "Mr. Brennan, he addressed their attorney. "Do you have any response to this video evidence?" Thomas Brennan looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. It was obvious that his clients had not informed him about the audio recordings or their true motivations for seeking custody. "Your Honor, we request a recess to review this new evidence and consult with our clients," Brennan said weakly. "Request denied," Judge Rodriguez replied firmly. "This evidence was provided to all parties 48 hours ago, according to discovery rules. Your client's celebration of abandoning their minor daughter speaks for itself." He turned his attention back to the video, replaying the audio portion where my parents called me dead weight and expressed satisfaction that she's not our problem anymore. Furthermore, Judge Williams added, "We have evidence that immediately after abandoning Cindy, the defendants changed their phone numbers, moved to a new apartment, and told neighbors their daughter had gone to live with relatives. This was not temporary care. This was permanent abandonment disguised with fraudulent documentation." Judge Rodriguez spent several minutes reviewing the complete file, including the federal criminal charges evidence of fraud and documentation of my academic and personal progress since gaining independence. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming and disturbing," he announced finally. "The defendants systematically planned and executed the abandonment of their minor daughter, while simultaneously committing fraud to profit from her supposed disabilities." He looked directly at my parents, his expression stern and disapproving. "David and Linda Morrison, your request for custody is denied. Furthermore, I am granting Cindy Morrison full emancipation effective immediately, and I am ordering that you have no contact with her except through legal proceedings related to the criminal charges you face." Additionally, Judge Rodriguez continued, "I am referring this matter to Child Protective Services for investigation into whether other minor children may be at risk from your documented pattern of fraud and abandonment." As the gavel came down, I felt a weight I had been carrying for 4 months finally lift from my shoulders. The parents who had thrown me away like garbage had been officially stripped of any legal authority over my life. But more importantly, their own words recorded for eternity had destroyed any possibility that they could ever again claim to be loving parents who had made difficult decisions in my best interest. The laughter they had shared while driving away from that homeless shelter had become evidence in a court of law that proved their cruelty beyond any reasonable doubt. As we left the courthouse, Judge Williams smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just delivered justice to people who thought they were too clever to face consequences. "They sealed their own fate the moment they decided to celebrate your abandonment," she said. "Sometimes the worst people are their own best prosecutors." The scared, abandoned girl they had left at that shelter was officially gone, replaced by an emancipated young adult with full control over her life and unlimited potential for the future. My parents had thought they were disposing of dead weight. Instead, they had created their own worst nightmare, a victim with proof resources and the legal authority to pursue justice without their interference. 3 years had passed since Judge Rodriguez granted my emancipation, and as I walked across the stage at Arizona State University's commencement ceremony, I could barely comprehend how dramatically my life had transformed. The girl who had been abandoned at a homeless shelter was now graduating summa cum laude with a double major in business administration and social work, surrounded by classmates who had no idea of the journey that brought me to this moment. "Cindy Morrison," announced the dean as I stepped forward to receive my diploma. Graduating with highest honors recipient of the Wheeler Technologies Excellence Scholarship and founder of the university's Family Trauma Advocacy Program. As I shook hands with university officials and posed for photographs, I spotted familiar faces in the audience who had supported me through this incredible journey. Judge Williams sat in the front row, beaming with pride at what her initial intervention had made possible. James Wheeler was there with his wife, representing not just his company's investment, but genuine mentorship that had shaped my academic and professional development. Jennifer Hayes waved from the section reserved for victim advocacy supporters, holding a sign that read, "From Survivor to Graduate." The ceremony concluded with traditional cap throwing and celebration, but my attention was drawn to an unexpected disturbance near the exit gates. Security personnel were speaking with two individuals who appeared agitated and were attempting to approach the graduation area despite not having proper credentials. As I moved closer to investigate, my heart stopped. David and Linda Morrison stood at the security checkpoint dressed in their best clothes and carrying flowers, apparently attempting to attend my graduation ceremony, uninvited. "We're her parents," Linda was saying to the security guard. "We just want to congratulate our daughter on her achievement and let her know how proud we are." The guard checked his list again, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I'm sorry, but you're not on the approved visitor list, and we have specific instructions that you're not permitted on campus without prior authorization." I approached the security station with Judge Williams, who had recognized the potential confrontation and moved to intercede before the situation escalated. "Officers, I'm Patricia Williams, Ms. Morrison's legal counsel," she said, presenting her identification. "These individuals are subject to a court-ordered no-contact provision and should not be on university property." David Morrison's expression shifted from nervous hope to angry determination as he realized I was within speaking distance. "Cindy, we need to talk to you," he called out, his voice carrying the commanding tone he had used throughout my childhood. "We've been trying to reach you for months, but your lawyers keep blocking our communications." "There's nothing to discuss," I replied firmly, maintaining the emotional distance I had learned to establish during 3 years of therapy and personal development. Judge Rodriguez's emancipation order was very clear about the terms of our separation. Linda Morrison stepped forward, tears streaming down her face in what appeared to be genuine emotion but felt manipulative given our history. "We made mistakes, sweetheart," she said, using the pet name that now sounded foreign and uncomfortable coming from her lips. "We were going through financial difficulties and made some poor decisions, but we never stopped loving you or being proud of your accomplishments." The attempt to minimize their systematic fraud and abandonment as poor decisions during financial difficulties revealed that they still refused to acknowledge the true nature of their crimes. "Your graduation proves that we raised you well," David added, apparently believing that my success vindicated their parenting, rather than demonstrating my resilience despite their abuse. "All we want is the chance to be part of your life again and maybe help you navigate some of the opportunities that are coming your way." Judge Williams stepped protectively between my parents and me, her expression stern and unwavering. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, you are currently facing federal criminal charges for fraud, identity theft, and child endangerment," she said in the prosecutorial tone that had intimidated courtroom opponents for 3 decades. "Your presence here constitutes violation of a court order, and I'm prepared to contact federal marshals if you don't leave immediately." "We just want what any parents would want," Linda protested, apparently convinced that playing the role of devoted parents would somehow overwrite the documented evidence of their abandonment and fraud. "We want to celebrate our daughter's success and be part of her future." The irony was staggering. The same people who had called me dead weight and celebrated getting rid of me were now claiming parental pride in achievements they had done everything possible to prevent. "Your daughter's success occurred entirely despite your actions, not because of them," Judge Williams replied coldly. "She survived homelessness, worked multiple jobs, earned scholarships through her own merit, and built a support network of people who actually cared about her welfare." As this confrontation continued, other graduates and their families began gathering to watch, creating exactly the kind of public scene my parents had probably hoped to avoid. Several people were recording the incident on their phones, apparently recognizing me from previous media coverage of my story. "You're making a mistake, Cindy," David said, his tone becoming more threatening as he realized gentle persuasion wasn't working. "We're still your family, and families should support each other. You're going to need guidance as you start your career, and turning your back on us now could hurt you in ways you don't understand." The veiled threat was typical of his manipulation tactics, suggesting that I would somehow suffer consequences for refusing to reconcile with people who had tried to destroy my life. My family consists of people who supported me when I had nothing and asked for nothing in return. I replied, gesturing toward Judge Williams, James Wheeler, and the other advocates who had gathered around us. You're strangers who happen to share my DNA and want to profit from accomplishments you tried to prevent. Security had contacted campus police, who arrived with authority to enforce the no-contact order and remove my parents from university property. As officers approached, Linda made one final, desperate appeal. "We know about the job offers you've received," she said quickly, apparently believing this information would convince me of their value. "Corporations want to hire you because of your survival story, and there are book deals and speaking opportunities worth millions. We could help you manage those opportunities and make sure you don't get taken advantage of." The statement revealed the true motivation for their sudden interest in reconciliation. They had been monitoring my career prospects and wanted to insert themselves into my professional success for financial gain. Mrs. Morrison interrupted one of the police officers. "You need to come with us. You're trespassing on university property and violating a court order." As my parents were escorted away, David turned back for one final comment that chilled me to my core. "This isn't over, Cindy," he called out. "You can't cut us out of your life forever. We're going to be part of your success whether you like it or not." The threat was unmistakable. Despite facing federal criminal charges, despite being prohibited from contacting me, despite having their parental rights legally terminated, they were planning to continue pursuing me and attempting to exploit my achievements. As the immediate drama subsided and my graduation celebration continued, James Wheeler approached with a concerned expression. "I think it's time we discussed enhanced security measures for your transition into professional life," he said quietly. "Your parents' behavior suggests they're not going to respect legal boundaries, and your visibility as an advocate and public speaker could make you vulnerable to more aggressive harassment." Judge Williams nodded in agreement. "We should also consider filing additional restraining orders that specifically address their attempts to interfere with your career and professional opportunities." As we left the university campus that day, I reflected on the surreal nature of celebrating my greatest academic achievement while being threatened by the people who had tried to prevent it. 3 years of college had given me knowledge credentials and professional opportunities beyond anything I had imagined while sleeping in that homeless shelter. But my parents' appearance at my graduation had also demonstrated that they remained committed to treating me as property they could exploit, rather than a human being deserving of respect and independence. The next phase of my journey would involve building a career that could withstand their continued harassment while using my experiences to help other abandoned children fight similar battles. The scared girl they had thrown away was now an educated advocate with resources and determination they had never anticipated. Their threat that "this isn't over" was absolutely correct, but they had fundamentally misunderstood who held the power in our ongoing conflict. I was no longer a vulnerable teenager they could manipulate and abandon. I was an adult with legal protection, professional opportunities, and powerful allies who would help me defend everything I had built. The laughter they had shared while driving away from that homeless shelter was about to be replaced by something far more serious, the realization that their discarded daughter had become someone capable of fighting back with every advantage education, law, and justice could provide. 2 years after graduation, my professional life had exceeded every expectation I had dared to form during those desperate nights in Paradise Valley homeless shelter. The nonprofit organization I had founded, Second Chances Foundation, occupied a renovated warehouse in downtown Phoenix and employed 18 full-time staff members who provided comprehensive services to abandoned and exploited youth throughout Arizona. The foundation's launch event was scheduled for a Thursday evening in late October, designed to attract major donors, government officials, and community leaders who could expand our reach and funding capacity. The venue was the ballroom of the Phoenix Art Museum, selected for its combination of elegance and accessibility that would appeal to both wealthy philanthropists and the young people we served. As I reviewed my keynote speech one final time, I felt a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation that had become familiar during my transition from client to service provider. Tonight's event would formally announce our expansion into 3 additional cities and the launch of our legal advocacy program that would provide free attorney services to minors facing family fraud situations. "Cindy, the guest registration is complete and everyone's asking about when you'll begin speaking," announced Maria Santos, my program director and closest professional colleague. Maria had been abandoned by her own family at 16 and had worked her way through college with support from early versions of the programs we now offered systematically. The ballroom was filled with an impressive cross-section of Arizona's civic and business leadership. Governor Katie Hobbs had sent a representative to announce state funding for our programs. Senator Mark Kelly was scheduled to present a congressional resolution recognizing our work. James Wheeler served as our board chairman and had brought several technology industry executives whose companies were considering major financial commitments. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats," announced the Master of Ceremonies as the formal program began. "We're honored tonight to celebrate 5 years of extraordinary achievement by Second Chances Foundation and to hear from its founder, Cindy Morrison, about expanding opportunities for Arizona's most vulnerable young people." As I approached the podium, the audience of 300 guests rose in sustained applause that felt surreal given my memories of standing in this same city as a homeless teenager with nothing but determination and borrowed clothes. 5 years ago, I stood in a government office explaining to a social worker why my parents had abandoned me at a homeless shelter. I began using the opening that had proven most effective with diverse audiences. Tonight, I stand before community leaders announcing that Second Chances Foundation has helped over 2,000 young people transition from crisis to independence. The presentation continued for 20 minutes, covering our program expansion, legislative advocacy, and success stories that demonstrated the Foundation's impact on individual lives and broader social policy. I had learned to balance emotional resonance with concrete data, ensuring that potential supporters understood both the human need and organizational effectiveness that justified their investment. Our newest initiative addresses family fraud, the systematic theft of children's identities by their own parents for financial gain. I explained transitioning to the program expansion that was closest to my personal experience. We estimate that over 5,000 Arizona children are currently victims of this crime, living in poverty, while their parents collect government benefits intended to support their supposed disabilities. As I outlined our legal advocacy expansion, I noticed a commotion near the ballroom entrance that seemed to be escalating despite security personnel's attempts to maintain order. 2 individuals were arguing with event staff and attempting to enter the reception area without proper credentials. "Excuse me for just one moment," I said, pausing my presentation as the disturbance became too loud to ignore. The cause of the disruption became immediately clear as David and Linda Morrison pushed past security guards and entered the ballroom, apparently having convinced someone that they belonged at the event. "We're Cindy's parents," Linda was saying loudly to anyone within hearing range. "We should be recognized as the people who raised the young woman you're here to celebrate." The audience buzzed with confusion and uncomfortable recognition as my parents made their way toward the front of the room, seemingly oblivious to the inappropriate nature of their disruption. "We're so proud of our daughter's accomplishments," David announced to the crowd, apparently believing that public pressure would force me to acknowledge them positively. "Everything she's achieved reflects the values and work ethic we instilled in her during her childhood." The statement was so audaciously false that several audience members who knew my story began murmuring expressions of shock and disapproval. Judge Williams, who was seated at the head table as our legal counsel, immediately stood and approached the security personnel, clearly preparing to have my parents removed before their presence could further disrupt the event. But instead of allowing security to handle the situation, I made a decision that would define how I dealt with their continued harassment for the rest of my life. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said into the microphone, my voice carrying clearly throughout the ballroom, I'd like you to meet David and Linda Morrison, the people who abandoned me at a homeless shelter when I was 17 years old and then celebrated by laughing about disposing of their dead weight. The audience fell completely silent as they realized they were witnessing a confrontation between an accomplished advocate and the parents who had tried to destroy her life. Since they've chosen to crash tonight's event, I continued, this seems like an appropriate time to share some recordings they left on my voicemail over the past 6 months. I pulled out my phone and activated the speaker function, filling the ballroom with audio that would destroy any remaining sympathy my parents might have expected from the audience. "You ungrateful little bitch," David's voice echoed through the museum ballroom. "We raised you, we fed you, we put a roof over your head for 17 years, and now you think you can cut us out of your success. We deserve our share of everything you've built." The audience listened in stunned silence as the recording continued. "You're making millions off your sob story about being abandoned," Linda's voice added. "But you were never abandoned. We provided temporary care when you needed it, and now you're lying about us to make yourself look better." A third message played automatically as the previous recording ended. "We know where you work, we know where you live, and we know who funds your little charity," David's voice threatened. "If you don't start sharing your success with the family that made it possible, we're going to tell your donors and supporters what you're really like. We're going to destroy everything you've built unless you give us what we deserve." As the final recording concluded, the ballroom remained eerily quiet for several seconds before Governor Hobbs's representatives stood and began applauding. Within moments, the entire audience was on their feet, giving me a standing ovation that felt like collective support against the people who were trying to exploit my success. These recordings represent attempted extortion, criminal harassment, and violation of multiple court orders, I announced as the applause subsided. They also demonstrate why Second Chances Foundation's Family Fraud Program is desperately needed to protect other young people from the kind of exploitation I continue to experience. My parents stood frozen near the entrance, apparently realizing that their public confrontation had backfired spectacularly. Instead of generating sympathy or forcing reconciliation, they had provided additional evidence of their ongoing criminality to an audience of 300 influential witnesses. Security personnel have copies of these recordings, which will be forwarded to federal prosecutors as evidence of continued harassment and extortion attempts. I continued, David and Linda Morrison are now banned from all Second Chances Foundation events and properties. As security guards approached to escort my parents out, Linda made one final desperate statement to the audience. "She's our daughter," she called out tearfully. "We love her, and we're proud of her. All we want is to be part of her life and share in the happiness she's created." "If you loved me," I replied into the microphone, "you wouldn't have abandoned me at a homeless shelter. If you were proud of me, you wouldn't be threatening to destroy my work. And if you wanted to be part of my life, you wouldn't be trying to extort money from a nonprofit that helps abused children." The security removal was swift and professional, but the impact of the confrontation continued to resonate throughout the remainder of the event. Multiple donors approached me afterward to express additional support. Several attorneys offered pro bono services to help combat ongoing harassment, and media representatives requested interviews about family fraud and parental exploitation of successful children. "That was brilliant," James Wheeler said as we prepared to leave the museum. "You turned their attempted sabotage into a powerful demonstration of exactly why your work is necessary." Judge Williams agreed, but her expression remained concerned about the escalating nature of my parents' behavior. "The recordings you played tonight constitute evidence of felony harassment and attempted extortion," she said. "But they also suggest your parents are becoming more desperate and potentially more dangerous as your profile continues to grow." As I drove home from the foundation launch, I reflected on the satisfaction of watching my parents' manipulation tactics fail completely in front of an audience that understood exactly what they were attempting. Their efforts to claim credit for my success had instead provided perfect examples of the ongoing abuse that made my advocacy work necessary. The scared girl they had abandoned was now a recognized leader, with institutional support and public credibility they couldn't undermine through threats or manipulation. Their attempt to exploit my success had become evidence of their continued criminality and proof that family fraud remained an urgent social problem requiring systematic intervention. The laughter they had shared while driving away from that homeless shelter had been replaced by public humiliation in front of Phoenix's civic leadership. But more importantly, their behavior had demonstrated to potential supporters exactly why organizations like Second Chances Foundation were essential for protecting vulnerable young people from exploitation by the adults who should have protected them. The foundation launch confrontation with my parents had generated significant media coverage that brought both opportunities and challenges I hadn't anticipated. Within a week of the museum event, Second Chances Foundation received donation offers totaling over $800,000, interview requests from 4 national news programs, and invitations to present our model at conferences in 12 different states. But the increased visibility had also intensified my parents' harassment to levels that were becoming both legally actionable and personally dangerous. The voicemails I had played at the museum were just the beginning of a campaign of threats and intimidation that had escalated throughout the month following our public confrontation. "Cindy, we need to discuss the security implications of your growing public profile," James Wheeler said during our monthly board meeting in early November. "Your parents' behavior has moved beyond nuisance harassment into territory that could require federal intervention." He was referring to a series of incidents that had occurred since the museum event. My parents had contacted major donors claiming I was mentally unstable and stealing foundation money. They had attempted to file false police reports, alleging that I was using drugs and engaging in criminal activity, and they had hired a private investigator to follow me and document my daily activities. "How bad has it gotten?" asked Maria Santos, who had been helping me screen communications to filter out threatening messages from legitimate foundation business. Last week alone, we documented 15 separate voicemail messages containing explicit threats. Judge Williams reported consulting notes from her legal pad. They're now claiming they have evidence of financial irregularities at the foundation and threatening to contact the IRS State Attorney General and major media outlets unless Cindy agrees to meet with them. She activated her phone's speaker function and played examples of the escalating harassment that had consumed hours of my time and emotional energy over the past month. "You think you're so smart with your fancy nonprofit and your rich friends." David's voice filled the conference room with venomous anger. "But we know what you're really doing. We know you're stealing money from that charity and using it for personal expenses. We have proof, and we're going to destroy you unless you start showing your parents some respect." The recording continued with increasingly specific threats about contacting donors, board members, and government regulators with fabricated evidence of misconduct they claimed to have documented. "We raised you, we know how you think, and we know all your weaknesses," Linda's voice added in a separate message. "You can't hide behind your lawyers forever. Eventually, you're going to have to deal with your family, and when that day comes, you're going to wish you had been more cooperative." A third recording contained the most explicit extortion attempt yet documented. "We want $50,000 in public recognition as the parents who inspired your success," David demanded. "You pay us what we deserve, and we'll leave you alone to play charity leader with your rich friends. You refuse, and we'll make sure everyone knows what a fraud you really are. We'll destroy your foundation, your reputation, and your future." As the recordings concluded, the board members sat in stunned silence at the brazenness of the attempted extortion and the specific nature of the threats against the foundation's credibility. These recordings constitute clear evidence of attempted extortion under federal law, Judge Williams explained. But more importantly, for our immediate security concerns, they suggest your parents are prepared to escalate their harassment until they achieve some level of financial or personal satisfaction. James Wheeler had been listening with the analytical expression he brought to solving complex business problems, and now he spoke with the decisive authority that had built his technology empire. "I think it's time we went on the offensive instead of just defending against their attacks," he said firmly. "Cindy has done nothing wrong. The Foundation's finances are completely transparent, and we have documented evidence of systematic criminal harassment spanning months." He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his contacts list, apparently preparing to make calls that would escalate our response significantly. "I'm going to contact the FBI field office and request a meeting about ongoing extortion and harassment targeting a federally recognized victim advocacy organization," James continued. "This has moved beyond family drama into interference with legitimate nonprofit operations that serve vulnerable populations." Judge Williams nodded approvingly. "Federal involvement is appropriate at this point. The threats against the Foundation's funding and operations constitute interference with interstate commerce, which gives federal agencies jurisdiction they wouldn't have for purely personal harassment." But before anyone could make those calls, my phone buzzed with an incoming voicemail message that would provide the most damaging evidence yet of my parents' criminal intentions. "You have one new voicemail message," the automated system announced as I activated the speaker function. "Listen carefully, you selfish little brat." Linda's voice was filled with rage and desperation that suggested they were reaching the end of their strategic patience. "We know about your big speech next week at the governor's conference, and we know about the television interview you're doing with that national news program." The message continued with details about my upcoming professional commitments that they shouldn't have known unless they were conducting sophisticated surveillance of my activities. "We're going to be at that conference." David's voice took over, apparently having planned this message carefully. "We're going to stand up during your speech and tell everyone what a liar you are. We're going to explain to your audience that you've built your entire career on false accusations against loving parents who sacrificed everything for your success." The threat was specific and actionable, providing exactly the kind of evidence law enforcement needed to intervene before my parents could disrupt major professional events. "But we'll give you one last chance to make this right." Linda's voice concluded the message. "Meet us tomorrow night at 7 o'clock at the Denny's restaurant on Camelback Road. Come alone, bring a check for $100,000, and agree to publicly acknowledge us as the parents who inspired your success. Do that, and we'll disappear from your life forever." "Refuse," David added ominously, "and we'll make sure your next public appearance becomes a humiliation you'll never recover from. We'll destroy everything you've built, and this time you won't have rich friends powerful enough to protect you." As the voicemail ended, Judge Williams was already dialing the FBI field office, while James Wheeler contacted his security consultant to arrange protection for the governor's conference and subsequent media appearances. This message contained specific threats of criminal disruption, detailed extortion demands, and evidence of surveillance that constitutes stalking under federal law. Judge Williams explained to the FBI agent who answered her call, "We need immediate intervention before they can carry out their threatened disruption of a state government conference." The next 12 hours involved intensive coordination between federal agents, state security personnel, and private protection services to ensure that my parents' threatened disruption would result in their arrest rather than damage to my reputation or Foundation operations. "We're setting a trap," explained FBI agent Sarah Mitchell during our emergency meeting the next morning. "Your parents have provided specific details about their planned criminal activities, and we're going to give them the opportunity to incriminate themselves in front of federal witnesses." The strategy involved allowing my parents to approach the governor's conference venue while federal agents documented their attempted disruption and arrested them for the multiple federal crimes their voicemails had outlined. "More importantly," Agent Mitchell continued, "their own recordings have given us evidence to pursue federal charges for systematic extortion harassment and interference with nonprofit operations. They've essentially provided a confession for every crime they've committed over the past 6 months." As I prepared for the governor's conference that would either mark my emergence as a recognized advocate or become the scene of my parents' final attempt to destroy my career, I reflected on how their escalating desperation had ultimately provided the evidence needed to stop their harassment permanently. The scared girl they had abandoned was now protected by federal agents and supported by state officials who recognized the importance of her work. Their threats to humiliate me at major professional events had instead created opportunities to demonstrate that family fraud victims could build successful careers despite ongoing harassment from their abusers. The laughter they had shared while driving away from that homeless shelter was about to be replaced by federal criminal charges that would finally end their ability to exploit and threaten the daughter they had tried to discard. The federal trial of David and Linda Morrison concluded on a gray Tuesday morning in March, exactly 18 months after their arrest at the governor's conference for attempted extortion and criminal harassment. As I sat in the gallery of the Phoenix Federal Courthouse watching the jury deliver their verdict, I could barely believe that this chapter of my nightmare was finally reaching its conclusion. Has the jury reached a verdict on all counts? Asked Federal Judge Maria Santos, whose stern demeanor had remained consistent throughout the 3-week trial. "We have, Your Honor," replied the jury foreman, a retired school principal whose expression suggested the deliberations had not been difficult. "On the count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, how do you find guilty? On the count of identity theft affecting interstate commerce, how do you find guilty? On the count of systematic extortion using electronic communications, how do you find guilty?" The verdict continued through 12 separate felony counts, each guilty verdict, representing years of criminal behavior that had finally been exposed and punished through the legal system. My parents sat at the defendant table with their court-appointed attorneys, their faces showing the shock of people who had never seriously believed they would face consequences for their actions. Federal prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez had presented a devastating case that included the voicemail recordings, financial evidence of their fraudulent benefit collection testimony from shelter workers who remembered their cruel celebration and documentation of their systematic harassment campaign against me and Second Chances Foundation. The defendants treated their own daughter as property to be exploited, then discarded when she became inconvenient. Rodriguez had argued during her closing statement. When that daughter succeeded despite their abuse, they attempted to reclaim ownership through threats, extortion, and criminal harassment that continued for years. The defense had attempted to portray my parents as overwhelmed individuals who had made mistakes during a family crisis, but their own recorded words had destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt. "Your Honor," Judge Santos announced as the verdict concluded, "sentencing will be scheduled for 4 weeks from today. The defendants will remain in custody pending sentencing, given the flight risk demonstrated by their pattern of fraud and deception." As the trial concluded and court officers led my parents away in handcuffs, I felt a mixture of relief and emotional exhaustion that had become familiar during the months of legal proceedings. Judge Williams, who had attended every day of testimony, approached with the satisfied expression of someone who had finally achieved justice after years of effort. "It's over, Cindy," she said, simply placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. "They'll never be able to hurt you again." The sentencing hearing 4 weeks later brought closure that exceeded my expectations for justice and accountability. Federal Judge Santos had clearly been influenced by victim impact statements from not just me, but dozens of other abandoned youth who had been helped by Second Chances Foundation programs. "David Morrison, you are sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation," Judge Santos announced. "You will also pay restitution of $127,000 to the government agencies you defrauded and to your daughter for the emotional and financial damages you inflicted. Linda Morrison, you are sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation with the same restitution requirements." But the most significant part of the sentencing involved conditions that would affect their behavior for years after their release. Furthermore, Judge Santos continued, both defendants are permanently prohibited from contacting Cindy Morrison or any Second Chances Foundation personnel through any means. You are prohibited from attending any public events where she is speaking, from contacting her employers or professional associates, and from making any public statements about her or her work. Finally, the judge added, as part of your supervised probation, you will be required to participate in victim impact programs where you will publicly acknowledge your crimes and discourage other parents from similar abuse of their children. As my parents were led away to begin their prison sentences, I expected to feel triumphant or satisfied. Instead, I felt a profound sadness for the family relationships that had been destroyed by their greed and cruelty. But that sadness was quickly replaced by shock when 3 weeks after their incarceration, I received a letter forwarded from the federal prison where they were being held. Dear Cindy, the letter began in Linda's handwriting. We need you to visit us immediately to discuss making this situation right. I read the letter with growing disbelief at their continued refusal to accept responsibility for their actions. We understand that you're angry about some mistakes we made during a difficult period in our family's life. The letter continued. But we're still your parents, and we believe this whole legal situation has gotten out of hand due to bad advice from lawyers who are using you for their own purposes. The letter went on to claim that they were victims of an unfair legal system, that my attorneys had manipulated me into making false accusations, and that I had a moral obligation to help them appeal their convictions. We think it would be best for everyone if you dropped the civil lawsuits against us and maybe helped us with legal expenses for our appeals. David had written in a section of the letter, after all, we're family and families should stick together during difficult times. The final paragraph revealed that they still viewed me as property they could control rather than an independent adult with the right to make my own decisions. We expect you to visit us within the next 2 weeks so we can discuss how to fix this mess. The letter concluded. Don't make us wait too long because we have information about your charity work that could cause problems if we decided to share it with the wrong people. Even from federal prison facing years of incarceration for crimes against me, they were still attempting extortion and manipulation. I shared the letter with Judge Williams, who immediately contacted federal prosecutors about this additional evidence of ongoing criminal behavior. Attempting to extort cooperation from their victim while incarcerated demonstrates that they remain unrepentant and continue to pose a threat, Prosecutor Rodriguez explained during our meeting. This letter will be added to their prison files and could affect their eligibility for early release. As months passed without any response to their letter, my parents apparently realized that their traditional manipulation tactics were no longer effective. A second letter arrived 6 months later with a markedly different tone. Cindy, we've had time to think about our actions and we realize we made serious mistakes. This letter began. We understand that you're angry and that we hurt you in ways we didn't fully comprehend at the time. The letter continued with what appeared to be genuine acknowledgement of some of their crimes, though it still minimized the systematic nature of their fraud and abuse. We hope that someday you might be able to forgive us and that we could have some kind of relationship again, Linda wrote. We don't expect you to visit us in prison, but maybe when we get out, we could start over and try to be the parents we should have been. This letter contained no demands, no threats, and no attempts at manipulation. For the first time since they had abandoned me at that homeless shelter, they seemed to be communicating as human beings who understood they had caused genuine harm. I chose not to respond to either letter, but I kept them as documentation of their gradual acceptance of responsibility and potential genuine remorse for their actions. The legal victory was complete. My parents faced years in federal prison. Their ability to harass me had been permanently eliminated, and they were required to make financial restitution for their crimes. But perhaps more importantly, their incarceration had finally forced them to confront the reality of what they had done to their own daughter. The scared girl they had abandoned was now a successful advocate whose work was protected by federal law, and whose future could no longer be threatened by people who had proven themselves willing to destroy their own child for financial gain. The laughter they had shared while driving away from that homeless shelter had been replaced by years of federal imprisonment and the slow recognition that they had thrown away something precious that could never be recovered. 2 years had passed since my parents began serving their federal sentences, and Second Chances Foundation had grown into a nationally recognized model for youth advocacy that now operated programs in 15 states. Our success had attracted federal funding, corporate partnerships, and legislative support that transformed individual crisis intervention into systematic policy change affecting thousands of vulnerable young people. Ms. Morrison, we have an unusual request from the Federal Bureau of Prisons that requires your input, announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Hayes during our quarterly legal review meeting in late September. She was different from the Jennifer Hayes who had been my victim advocate years earlier, but the coincidence of names always reminded me of how many people had contributed to my journey from homeless teenager to national advocate. As part of your parents' supervised rehabilitation program, they're required to participate in victim impact initiatives that help other offenders understand the consequences of family-related crimes. Attorney Hayes explained, opening a folder marked with Federal Prison System letterhead. The program involves creating educational materials where convicted offenders acknowledge their crimes and explain the impact on their victims. These materials are used in parenting classes, criminal justice education, and family court proceedings throughout the federal system. She spread several documents across the conference table, revealing a proposal that was both gratifying and emotionally complex. David and Linda Morrison have been selected to participate in a pilot program where they would create victim impact videos acknowledging their systematic fraud, explaining how they abandoned and exploited their daughter, and discouraging other parents from similar criminal behavior. The proposal outlined a comprehensive documentation project that would require my parents to publicly detail every aspect of their crimes, from the initial planning of my abandonment through their years of harassment and extortion attempts. Their participation would be videotaped and distributed to federal agencies, state courts, social service organizations, and educational institutions as training materials about family fraud and child exploitation. Attorney Hayes continued, "But here's the significant part for you personally as their victim. You have the right to review the content they produce and request modifications to ensure accuracy and completeness." Judge Williams, who remained my primary legal counsel despite her official retirement, studied the proposal with the analytical expression she brought to complex legal strategy decisions. This could provide more comprehensive acknowledgement of their crimes than we achieved even through the criminal trial, she observed. It would also create permanent documentation that prevents them from later claiming they were wrongly convicted or that their actions weren't as severe as portrayed. The program requirements were extensive and detailed. My parents would be required to explain the systematic nature of their fraud, acknowledge the specific harm they had inflicted on me, detail their harassment and extortion attempts, and provide explicit warnings to other parents about the criminal and personal consequences of similar behavior. Additionally, Attorney Hayes added, successful completion of this program is now a requirement for their supervised probation. If they refuse to participate or produce inadequate materials, their sentences could be extended, and their early release eligibility would be eliminated. Over the following weeks, I reviewed multiple drafts of scripts my parents had written, attempting to fulfill the program requirements. Their initial efforts were predictably inadequate, minimizing their crimes and focusing on their own suffering rather than the impact on their victim. We made some poor financial decisions during a difficult period in our lives. David's first script began, "We regret that our daughter was hurt by our mistakes, and we hope other parents can learn from our experience." I rejected this version and submitted detailed feedback requiring them to acknowledge the systematic and premeditated nature of their crimes, the specific methods they had used to exploit government benefits, and the years of harassment they had conducted after my success began. The second draft was significantly more comprehensive, but still avoided full accountability for their actions. We planned and executed the abandonment of our 17-year-old daughter at a homeless shelter, while simultaneously collecting government benefits by falsely claiming she was disabled. Linda's revised script acknowledged. We celebrated her abandonment, changed our phone numbers to prevent contact, and told neighbors she had moved away. This version was more accurate but failed to address their subsequent harassment campaign or acknowledge the emotional trauma they had inflicted. By the fourth revision produced after months of federal supervision and counseling, they had finally created materials that met the program's standards for comprehensive acknowledgement and genuine accountability. I am David Morrison, and I was convicted of federal crimes, including wire fraud, identity theft, and systematic extortion. Targeting my own daughter, the final video script began. For years, my wife and I stole government benefits by falsely claiming our daughter was mentally disabled while she attended school normally and showed no signs of any disabilities. The script continued with detailed acknowledgement of every aspect of their crimes, from the forged medical records to their celebration of abandoning me, to their years of threatening harassment as my career developed. We called our daughter dead weight and laughed about disposing of her because we viewed her as a financial burden rather than a human being deserving love and support. Linda's section acknowledged. When she succeeded, despite our abandonment, we attempted to reclaim control over her life and extract money from her achievements through systematic extortion and criminal threats. The final version included explicit warnings to other parents that were both legally mandated and personally meaningful. Parents who abandon their children or exploit them for financial gain will face federal criminal prosecution, years in prison, and the permanent loss of any relationship with children they abuse. David concluded, "No amount of money or temporary convenience is worth destroying your own child's life and sacrificing your family forever." When the completed victim impact materials were distributed to federal agencies and educational institutions, Second Chances Foundation began receiving calls from other advocacy organizations requesting permission to use the videos in their own training programs. Your parents' acknowledgement materials have become some of the most effective educational tools we have for explaining family fraud to law enforcement social workers and judicial officials, reported Dr. Michelle Rodriguez from the National Center for Child Abuse Prevention. Their detailed explanation of how they planned and executed systematic exploitation of their own daughter helps professionals recognize similar patterns in other families and intervene before children are abandoned or seriously harmed. The irony was profound. The same people who had tried to silence and exploit me were now required by federal law to educate others about precisely the crimes they had committed and to promote the work of organizations like the one I had founded to help their victims. But perhaps the most significant development occurred when Second Chances Foundation was selected as the national model for family fraud prevention and victim advocacy by the Department of Health and Human Services. Our programs would be replicated in all 50 states with federal funding totaling $12 million annually. Ms. Morrison announced HHS Secretary Xavier Becerra during the grant award ceremony in Washington. Second Chances Foundation has demonstrated that survivors of family abuse can become the most effective advocates for preventing similar crimes and supporting other victims. Your organization's success in transforming personal trauma into systematic policy change represents the best of American resilience and innovation in social services. As I stood in the nation's capital accepting federal recognition for work that had grown from my desperate survival efforts as a homeless teenager, I reflected on the complete reversal of power that had occurred between my parents and me over the past 7 years. They had abandoned me, believing I was worthless dead weight who would disappear into poverty and obscurity. Instead, I had built a nationally recognized organization that helped thousands of vulnerable young people and influenced policy changes that protected children from exactly the crimes my parents had committed. They were now required by federal law to publicly acknowledge their crimes, promote the importance of organizations like mine, and serve as cautionary examples for other potential abusers. Their own words, recorded under legal supervision, had become tools for educating people about preventing family fraud and supporting its victims. The laughter they had shared while driving away from that homeless shelter had been replaced by federally mandated public confession that would serve as permanent documentation of their cruelty and criminality. The scared girl they had discarded had become the advocate thousands of other abandoned children needed, turning personal survival into systematic change that would protect vulnerable families for generations to come. 5 years had passed since that gray morning when David and Linda Morrison were led away from federal court in handcuffs, and as I stood before the United States Senate Subcommittee on Children and Families, I could barely comprehend the journey that had brought me to this moment. The abandoned teenager who once slept on a cot in Paradise Valley homeless shelter was now testifying before Congress about legislation that would transform how America protects vulnerable children from family exploitation. Senator Murray, members of the subcommittee, I began addressing the distinguished panel of lawmakers whose attention represented the culmination of years of advocacy work. My name is Cindy Morrison, and I am the founder and executive director of Second Chances Foundation, which now serves over 10,000 abandoned and exploited youth annually across all 50 states. The hearing room was filled with federal officials, child welfare advocates, and media representatives who had come to witness testimony about the Abandoned Children Protection Act, landmark legislation that would close the legal loopholes my parents had exploited and provide comprehensive support for young people facing family fraud situations. 7 years ago, my parents drove me 150 miles from our home and abandoned me at a homeless shelter after creating fraudulent documents claiming I was an adult with mental disabilities. I continued using the opening that had become familiar through hundreds of speaking engagements and media interviews. While I struggled to survive as a homeless teenager, they collected over $40,000 in government benefits intended to support my supposed disabilities. When I succeeded, despite their abandonment, and built a career helping other victimized youth, they attempted to extort money from my nonprofit organization through systematic harassment that continued for years. The senators listened with expressions of shock and disgust that remained consistent regardless of how many times I told this story to influential audiences. The Abandoned Children Protection Act would prevent future parents from exploiting legal and bureaucratic loopholes to abuse their own children for financial gain. I explained outlining legislative provisions that had been developed through collaboration between Second Chances Foundation federal agencies and bipartisan congressional leadership. It would also provide comprehensive support services for abandoned youth, ensuring that children who survive family exploitation have access to educational opportunities, legal advocacy, and mental health resources that help them build successful, independent lives. As I concluded my formal testimony, Senator Patty Murray asked the question that provided an opportunity to address the broader implications of family fraud beyond individual cases. Ms. Morrison, based on your organization's work with thousands of abandoned youth, how widespread do you believe this problem has become? Senator, our research indicates that family-related fraud and exploitation affects over 50,000 American children annually. I replied, citing statistics that had motivated congressional interest in federal legislation. Most of these cases involve parents stealing their children's identities to commit financial fraud, but significant numbers also include abandonment designed to avoid child support, obligations, exploitation of disabled children's government benefits, and systematic educational neglect that prevents children from developing skills needed for independence. The hearing continued for 3 hours, covering technical aspects of the proposed legislation funding mechanisms for expanded victim services and coordination between federal and state agencies responsible for child protection. But the most meaningful moment occurred during the closing statements, when Senator Murray announced that the committee would vote unanimously to advance the legislation to the full Senate. Ms. Morrison's testimony and the work of Second Chances Foundation demonstrate that survivors of the worst family abuse can become the most effective advocates for systematic change, Senator Murray said. This legislation honors her resilience while ensuring that future children facing similar exploitation will have legal protections and support services that were not available when she needed them. As I left the Capitol building and walked through Washington's afternoon sunshine, my phone buzzed with a text message that brought this long journey full circle in an unexpected way. "Cindy, this is Linda Morrison. David and I were released from federal prison last month and are living in a halfway house in Phoenix. We saw news coverage of your congressional testimony today, and we wanted you to know how proud we are of what you've accomplished and how sorry we are for everything we put you through." The message continued with what appeared to be genuine remorse and acknowledgement of the damage they had caused. "We understand that you probably don't want to hear from us, and we respect whatever decision you make about future contact. But we needed you to know that watching your success has helped us understand how badly we failed as parents and how much we threw away when we chose money over our daughter, We hope that someday, maybe years from now, you might be willing to meet with us so we can apologize properly and tell you how sorry we are for trying to destroy something precious that we should have protected and cherished." I stared at the message for several minutes, processing emotions I hadn't expected to feel. After years of anger, legal battles, and protective distance, my parents were finally communicating as human beings who understood the magnitude of what they had lost. But more importantly, I realized that my response to their message would define how I chose to move forward with my life and work. I typed a careful reply that reflected the person I had become rather than the scared girl they had abandoned. "David and Linda, I appreciate your message and your acknowledgement of the harm you caused. I'm glad to hear that you've learned from your experiences and that you understand the consequences of your choices. I'm not ready for direct contact, but I hope your remaining years are spent helping other families avoid the mistakes you made. Take care of yourselves." The response was neither vengeful nor welcoming, but it was honest and reflected the emotional distance I had learned to maintain for my own well-being. That evening, as I sat in my Arlington apartment reviewing notes from the congressional hearing, I reflected on the complete transformation that had occurred since that August day when I stood outside a homeless shelter with nothing but determination and borrowed clothes. The abandoned girl had become a nationally recognized advocate whose work influenced federal legislation. The dead weight they had disposed of had built an organization that helped thousands of vulnerable families. The daughter they had tried to exploit and silence had testified before the United States Senate about protecting children from exactly the crimes they had committed. My memoir, From Dead Weight to Second Chances, had become a bestseller whose proceeds funded expanded foundation programs. The speaking engagements they had once threatened to disrupt now commanded audiences of thousands who wanted to understand how trauma could be transformed into purpose. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that healing didn't require forgiveness of people who had proven themselves incapable of genuine change. It required building something meaningful from the pain they had inflicted and using that experience to prevent others from suffering similar abuse. The scared teenager who had once wondered if she would survive homelessness had become a woman who understood that survival itself could be an act of resistance against people who expected their victims to fail. The laughter my parents had shared while driving away from that homeless shelter had been replaced by something far more significant: the realization that their discarded daughter had become living proof that abandoned children possess strength and potential their abusers never recognize. Every young person who found safety through Second Chances Foundation programs represented victory over the cruelty that had tried to destroy me. Every policy change that protected vulnerable families honored the suffering of all abandoned children. Every speaking engagement that educated audiences about family fraud prevented other parents from choosing exploitation over love. I had learned that justice doesn't always look like punishment or revenge. Sometimes it looks like building something beautiful from the wreckage others create and using your survival to light the way for people still lost in darkness. As I prepared for bed in my comfortable apartment surrounded by awards and recognition that represented years of hard work and dedication, I felt something I had never experienced during my childhood: genuine pride in the life I had built and deep satisfaction with the person I had chosen to become. The girl my parents had called dead weight and thrown away like garbage had become someone who understood that every person has value, every child deserves protection, and every survivor has the potential to transform their pain into purpose that makes the world a little bit safer for the next generation of vulnerable young people. Now I have a question for you. Have you ever felt abandoned or undervalued by people who were supposed to care about you? How did you find the strength to keep moving forward when everything seemed hopeless? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else who needs to hear that survival is possible, even when the people closest to you fail to recognize your worth. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help it reach other people who might need encouragement during their own difficult times. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about resilient survival and the power of turning trauma into triumph. And please share this video with anyone in your life who needs a reminder that their current circumstances don't define their future potential. Thank you for listening to my journey from that homeless shelter to the halls of Congress. I hope it reminds you that no matter how badly others treat you or how hopeless your situation seems, you have the power to build something meaningful from whatever life hands you. Sometimes the people who throw you away are actually freeing you to become someone far more remarkable than they ever imagined possible.